Imagine yourself drifting back through time, gently carried by the hush of evening. The lanterns along the monastery wall glow faintly, their flickering light softening the edges of the ancient stone. Shadows stretch long and thin across the cobbled courtyard, while the cool night air carries the faint fragrance of damp earth and distant wood smoke. The river nearby moves slowly, as if even the water is drowsy at this hour, its surface catching the last silver of moonlight. Beyond the gates, the world of towns and villages stirs with its own noise and needs merchants packing away goods, farmers returning from fields, children curled close to hearthspot here, within cloistered walls. Life follows a quieter rhythm. It is a rhythm not measured by the bustle of markets or the urgency of trade, but by bells, prayers, and the steady turning of the seasons. In the Middle Ages, monks chose to live lives that might seem peculiar, even alien, to us today. Their routines were not hurried, but measured. They carried with them a sense of order that few of us ever experience in our restless age. They woke long before the sun, pulled from warm straw beds by the tolling of a heavy bell. In silence, they walked across cold stone floors, their woolen habits brushing softly as they made their way to the chapel. There, beneath high arches and candlelit shadows, their voices rose together in chants. The sound echoed against the stone, swelling and falling like a tide, ancient words filling the air with a harmony that seemed to belong to both earth and heaven. This was the first of many prayers that shaped their day. To a monk, the hours were not simply blocks of time to be filled, but sacred intervals marked by devotion. The bell was not an interruption, but a heartbeat, a steady reminder that all of life, even its most ordinary moments, could be framed by reverence. After prayer came work, but work, too, was a form of prayer. Some monks walked out to the gardens in the pale light of dawn, where rows of herbs and vegetables glistened with dew. Their hands touched the soil with patience, pulling weeds, gathering leaves, planting seeds. Others tended the chickens or moved toward the beehives, their movements unhurried, their tasks small but essential. The rising sun painted the monastery walls with gold as they labored, and the fragrance of rosemary, thyme, and damp earth filled the morning air. As the day lengthened, they would share simple meals together, eaten in silence in the refectory. The scrape of wooden spoons, the soft creak of benches, and the voice of a reader, these were the only sounds that accompanied their bread and broth. Conversation was set aside, so that even eating became an act of mindfulness, a reminder that nourishment was both a gift and a necessity. There was no indulgence here, no banquet, only what was needed to carry the body gently into the next task. Then came the hours of labor and learning. Some monks retreated into the scriptorium, where candles flickered and quills scratched patiently across parchment. There, knowledge was preserved, word by word, page by page, in delicate script and vivid illumination. Others worked in the infirmary, where jars of herbs lined the shelves, and the fragrance of lavender and chamomile hung in the air. Still others cared for the storerooms, or mended clothing, or repaired tools. Each task was small, yet each was bound into the life of the community, sustaining not only the monastery itself, but also the people who lived nearby, who often came to the monks for help in times of need. And through it, all through garden and kitchen, through scriptorium and chapel, silence wove like a thread. It was not the silence of emptiness, but of intention, a silence filled with purpose, with awareness, with the sense that every action, however ordinary, was part of a greater rhythm. To walk through the cloister garden in such quiet was to hear the world more clearly, the rustle of ivy on stone, the hum of bees, the footfalls of one's own sandals on gravel. It was to be reminded that peace was not found in noise or haste, but in stillness. To us, their lives may seem austere, a narrow bed of straw, a plain woolen garment, to modest meals a day. Yet to the monks, these were not hardships, but freedoms, freedoms from distraction, from vanity, from the endless reaching for more. In simplicity, they found clarity. In repetition, they found stability. In silence, they found a voice that was not their own, but that of the world itself, slow, steady, enduring. Tonight, we will wander slowly through this monastic world. Together, we will not hurry. We will step carefully along the cloister paths, pausing to notice the dew on cabbages, the warmth of a clay bowl held between work-worn hands, the faint golden light spilling through stained glass. We will linger in the scriptorium and watch the careful movements of ink across parchment, where letters themselves became a prayer. We will sit quietly in the refectory, listening as sacred words accompany the breaking of bread. We will pass through the infirmary, where herbs and kindness brought relief to the weary. We will watch as seasons change, the deep chill of winter nights, the abundant warmth of summer afternoons, and we will see how within those stone walls, life carried on with patience and endurance. The monks did not live in pursuit of glory, nor did they chase after wealth or fame. Their lives remind us that there is another way to live, one shaped by steady rhythms rather than sudden bursts, one where time is not consumed but savored. Their days whisper across centuries to us now, offering gentle lessons in balance, in devotion, and in the beauty of ordinary moments. So, as you listen, allow yourself to be carried by their pace. Breathe slowly, as though walking beneath the vaulted ceilings of a dim chapel. Let your thoughts settle like leaves on still water. Feel the soft glow of imagined candlelight flicker across your mind, and hear the quiet toll of a distant bell marking the passage of time. You need not move quickly here. The world of the monks was not built for haste. It was built for patience, for stillness, for the steady unfolding of days that led, not to exhaustion, but to peace. Settle back now. Let the warmth of an imagined firelight calm your spirit, and allow this story to unfold as softly as evening bells fading into the night. For tonight, you are safe within the cloister walls, where the only urgency is the turning of the seasons, and the only sound is the gentle heartbeat of a life lived slowly. The night is deep and quiet. The stars still shine above the dark fields of medieval Europe, and the village outside the monastery walls sleeps in silence. Farmers lie beneath thatched roofs, their fires dying low. The narrow streets are empty, only the sound of an owl echoing now and then. Yet, within the monastery, something stirs. A bell, heavy and low, breaks the silence. Its sound rolls across stone walls and fields, a slow rhythm in the cold air. It is not loud enough to wake the whole countryside, but it is clear inside the cloister walls. For the monks, this is the beginning of the day, though the day itself has not yet arrived. It is still night, still wrapped in darkness. The bell is their call, their reminder that even the quietest hours belong to prayer. This first gathering is called matins. To us, it might feel strange to wake in the middle of the night for prayer, but for the monks, this rhythm is natural, a heartbeat that shapes every moment of their lives. Their world does not follow the hours of trade or the rush of markets. It follows the sound of bells, steady and sure, guiding them through prayer, work, rest, and silence. The monks rise from their beds. Their cells are small, simple, with rough walls of stone or timber, a straw mattress, and a wool blanket for warmth. There is little decoration, perhaps a wooden cross, a candle stub, or a simple chest for clothing. Each cell is more than a bedroom. It is a space for stillness, for private reflection, for rest without distraction. In this dark hour, the air is cold. Breath clouds in the room as the monk pulls on his habit, a simple garment of coarse wool. The cloth is rough but strong, meant not for beauty but for use, and it carries the faint smell of earth and smoke from the fires that warmed the wool. Outside, the cloister is waiting. The monastery corridors are dim, lit only by small lanterns or the faint glow of torches along the walls. Stone floors are cool beneath sandaled feet. The sound of movement is soft robes brushing, sandals tapping lightly, doors opening and closing. One by one, the monks gather in silence. They do not speak, for this is not a time for words. It is a time for joining together in quiet purpose. The chapel itself stands as the heart of the monastery. By day it will glow with sun filtering through stained glass, but at this hour it is lit by candles. The air smells faintly of beeswax and smoke. Shadows dance across the stone, and the vaulted ceiling disappears into darkness. The monks gather in rows, each taking his place, their faces pale in the candlelight. The bell falls silent now, its work complete. In its place, another rhythm begins. Voices rise low at first, then steady. They chant ancient words, their Latin syllables, smooth and flowing. To modern ears, the sound might seem strange, but to the monks it is familiar, comforting. The chant is not a performance. It is prayer in its purest form, where words are carried on sound rather than speech. The notes echo through the chapel, bouncing off stone walls, filling every space with calm. Time feels different in these moments. Outside, the night stretches on, the stars slowly wheeling above empty fields. But here, Inside, the chant creates its own sense of time. The rhythm is slow, steady, like the breathing of the world itself. It is not about finishing quickly, but about being present. Each note is drawn out, each pause filled with silence. The monks stand together, bound not by conversation or touch, but by sound and stillness. Matins could last an hour or more, depending on the season or the tradition of the monastery. In summer, when days are long and nights are short, it might feel briefer. In winter, when nights are heavy and long, the service can stretch deeper into the darkness. Yet the monks do not complain. For them, this hour is a gift. To wake while others sleep is to step into a different world, a world where silence rules, where the only light comes from candles, and where the only sound is prayer. When the chanting ends, the monks bow their heads, candles flicker, shadows shift, and silence returns. They rise slowly, one by one, and file out of the chapel. The air outside feels colder now, as if the night has deepened while they prayed. Their sandals crunch softly on the gravel paths as they walk back through. The cloister's lanterns sway gently in the breeze, their light glimmering on wet stone. By now, the horizon is beginning to soften. The first hint of dawn is near. In the east, the sky shows the faintest shade of grey, like the slow lifting of a curtain. Birds stir in the trees, stretching their wings. The world beyond the monastery still sleeps, but within the walls, the monks are awake, alert, and ready to continue their day. It is strange to imagine, perhaps, that such an early hour could be peaceful. For many of us, waking in darkness feels harsh, unwelcome. But for the monks, it was expected, even cherished. To begin the day with prayer was to give shape to the hours that followed. Without matins, the rhythm of the monastery would be incomplete, like a song missing its first note. Their lives were bound to this rhythm. Every day, the bell before dawn began the same cycle. Prayer, work, meal, silence, prayer again. To us, it might seem monotonous. To them, it was stability, a life built not on change but on repetition. In repetition, they found meaning. The world outside might be full of noise, trade, disputes, and dangers, but inside the cloister, the rhythm never failed. The bell always tolled, the prayers always rose, the day always followed its path. And so, the monks settled into the calm of their early routine. The sky would brighten soon, the gardens would call for tending, the manuscripts for copying, the storerooms for checking. But for now, in this quiet between night and day, they carried with them the stillness of matins, the sound of chants lingering in the mind, the glow of candlelight fading behind them, and the knowledge that, whatever the hours ahead might bring, they had already begun with peace. Sleepy though it may seem, this ritual connected them to something larger than themselves. Each time they rose at the bell, each time they stood in candlelight and chanted words older than their own lifetimes, they became part of a chain stretching across centuries. Monks before them had done the same. Monks after them would continue, and in that chain there was comfort. No one stood alone. Each voice was part of a chorus, each life part of a rhythm greater than the individual. As the first pale light touched the eastern horizon, the monastery exhaled. Doors creaked open, footsteps spread out across stone paths, and the first labors of the day began. But in the quiet memory of that hour before dawn, the sound of the bell remained, slow, steady, calming, like the heartbeat of the world itself. The first light of day spreads slowly across the sky. At first, it is little more than a pale glow on the horizon, a soft hint of gold against the retreating darkness. The stars, so bright only an hour before, fade gently, one by one, until only the brightest remain. The moon lingers, thin and distant, like a quiet guardian of the night. But dawn is patient, and it does not hurry. Light spills gradually across the fields and rooftops, touching the world with calm. Inside the monastery, the night prayers have ended. The monks return to their simple cells, resting briefly before the bell calls them again. This time, it is not the deep silence of matins, but the start of daily labor. When they rise once more, the sky has already begun to brighten. The cold of night softens into a chill morning air, carrying the fragrance of dew-soaked grass, of damp earth, and of smoke rising from the kitchen fires. The monastery stirs slowly, like a great body awakening. Doors open, footsteps echo softly in the cloisters, and figures in plain wool habits begin to move across the courtyards. There is no rush. Each task waits with patience, as it always does. The monks move steadily, some toward the gardens, others toward the barns, the chicken coops, or the apiary, where bees will soon hum with life. The monastery garden is the first to feel their care. Its rows of plants, though simple, are precious. Vegetables grow here in neat lines, cabbages with wide green leaves, onions with slender shoots, beans climbing slowly on wooden poles. Between them, herbs spread in smaller beds-time, sage, rosemary, fennel, and mint. Each plant is tended carefully, for the monastery depends on these foods and remedies. A monk bends to pull weeds, his hands rough from labor but gentle in touch. Another waters the beds, carrying buckets drawn from the well. The sound of water pouring onto soil mingles with the calls of waking birds. The air is fresh, cool, and filled with the faint fragrance of rosemary, warmed by the rising sun. Nearby, another monk scatters grain for the chickens. The birds rush forward with soft clucks, their feathers ruffling as they peck at the ground. Eggs will be gathered later, carried in baskets to the kitchen. A short distance away, the bees stand in their wooden frames, quiet for now, though soon alive with the buzzing of bees. Honey is treasured in the monastery, not only as food, but as medicine, and as a sweetener for the few special treats the monks are allowed. The beekeeper moves carefully, checking the hives, ensuring that all is well. His steps are slow, deliberate, as though each movement is part of a prayer. The rising sun paints the stone walls of the monastery in gold. Shadows retreat across the grass, and the courtyard fills with gentle light. The monks move steadily, never hurried. Their habits, coarse and brown or black depending on the order, sway softly as they bend and lift, pull and carry. Silence remains, but it is not an empty silence. It is a silence full of meaning, filled with the quiet sounds of life. The scrape of a hoe in the soil, the creak of a wooden bucket, the rustle of leaves, the soft breath of men at work. In this rhythm, the morning takes shape. For the monks, labor is not separate from devotion. Work is prayer, and prayer is work. To tend the garden, to feed the animals, to carry water, these are not distractions from spiritual life, but expressions of it. Every act, however small, is performed with patience and care, as though offered in service not just to the community, but to something higher. Imagine, then, walking with them through the fields at this hour. The ground is damp with dew, soaking the hems of robes. Birds call from hedgerows, their songs bright and hopeful. The sun rises slowly, washing the land in warmth, though the air still carries the sharpness of morning. The monks do not speak. They do not need to. Their movements are steady, each one aware of his task, each one absorbed in the quiet flow of the hour. The fields beyond the cloister wall stretch out in orderly rows. Wheat grows here, tall and green in spring, golden and heavy in summer. The monks may not be farmers in the sense of the peasants outside, but they care deeply for these crops. Bread is the heart of their meals, and without these fields, the monastery could not survive. In the distance, one can see a monk walking with a spade over his shoulder, ready to mend the furrows, while another checks the irrigation channels that guide water to the plants. Their pace is slow, their eyes lowered, their thoughts steady. The apiary, too, begins to stir as the sun climbs higher. Bees hum softly, stretching their wings in the warmth. A monk trained in their care inspects the wooden hives, listening to the faint vibrations inside. Honey will not be gathered every day, but the bees require steady attention. Their work, though unseen, mirrors the monks' own small labors, repeated endlessly, sustaining something larger than themselves. Back in the garden, the scent of mint rises as leaves are crushed underfoot. Lavender nods gently in the breeze, its purple blossoms bright against the green. The infirmary depends on these herbs. Chamomile for rest, sage for sore throats, fennel for digestion, mint for the stomach, lavender for calming the spirit. The monks are not doctors in the modern sense, but they are healers in their way, drawing wisdom from the plants around them. To care for the garden is also to care for the sick, to prepare remedies for times of weakness, to soften the edges of suffering. The sun climbs higher now, flooding the cloisters with warm light. The stone walls gleam, their rough textures softened by gold. Birds flit across the courtyard, their wings catching the light as they dart between roof and tree. The monks continue their labor, unhurried, unbroken, each movement fitting neatly into the rhythm of the morning. There is no chatter, no command, no need for instruction. Each monk knows what to do, and each does it with calm acceptance. There is peace in this work. It is not the peace of idleness, but of purpose. Every weed pulled, every seed sown, every animal fed is part of the greater whole. The monastery is sustained not by miracles, but by steady effort. Yet in that effort, there is quiet devotion. The monks see no divide between body and spirit, between labor and prayer. To lift a bucket of water is to honor creation. To feed a chicken is to serve the community. To plant a seed is to express hope for the future. As the morning passes, the garden begins to glow in full sunlight. Dew dries from the leaves, and the air warms gently. The monks pause briefly, wiping their brows, then return to their tasks. Their robes, though plain, seem to belong to the landscape, blending with the earth and stone around them. The monastery itself feels alive at this hour, each corner touched by light, each sound softened by calm. In time, the bell will call them, again, pulling them from field and garden back to the chapel. There, their voices will rise once more in chant, echoing against the stone walls. But for now, their prayer is in their hands, the feel of soil beneath their fingers, the weight of a hoe in the palm, the warmth of sun on their backs. It is a prayer without words, a devotion carried out in quiet labor. Morning light settles fully across the quiet fields. The monks continue their steady rhythm, part of a cycle that has lasted for centuries. And as we watch, we too can feel the calm of their world, the peace of ordinary work, the beauty of silence, the slow unfolding of day beneath the golden sun. The morning hours have passed, and the monastery has already lived through prayers and quiet labor. The garden has been tended, the chickens fed, the bees checked, and the fields walked. The sun climbs higher in the sky now, drawing away the mist that once clung to the grass and filling the courtyards with warm light. The monks move with calm rhythm toward their next shared act of devotion. Not another chant, not another service, but the simple act of eating. For in the medieval monastery, a meal was never just a meal. It was a moment of order, of silence, of steady nourishment. Bread, broth, and quiet meals formed the backbone of their lives. Each one was modest, sometimes meager, but always received with gratitude. To eat was not to indulge, but to carry on. And in the way of the monks, even this simple act of eating became a kind of prayer. The monastery bell rings again, its sound spreading across the cloisters and fields. The monks, scattered at their work, set aside their tools and washed their hands. Slowly, they walk back through the stone passages, their sandals scuffing softly against the worn floors. The air carries the faint smell of bread, baked earlier that morning in the monastery oven, and of simmering broth drifting from the kitchen. The refectory, where they gather, is a long hall lined with wooden tables. The walls are plain, perhaps decorated only with a simple cross or a painted figure of a saint. The benches creak under the weight of men in rough woolen habits. Sunlight pours in through narrow windows, falling in quiet shafts across the stone floor. Everything about this space is modest, practical, and yet dignified. It is not meant for comfort, but for order. As the monks settle in their places, silence is expected. Voices do not rise here. There is no chatter about the morning's work, no casual talk of weather or tasks. Conversation at table is not part of monastic life. Instead, the meal is filled with the sound of movement, the scrape of wooden spoons, the faint clatter of bowls, the shifting of robes as men sit upright in their places. Yet the silence is not complete. One voice does rise above the rest. From a raised pulpit or simple lectern, a monk reads aloud. His voice is steady, calm, and unhurried. He does not speak to entertain, nor to distract. Instead, he recites sacred texts, perhaps passages of scripture, perhaps the words of a church father, perhaps the life of a saint. The words float gently through the hall, joining the quiet rhythm of eating. The monks do not look up. They eat and they listen, their minds held in the balance between body and soul. The food itself is simple. Bread is always present, coarse loaves, dark with grain, often dense and heavy. The wheat or barley used may have come from the monastery's own fields, ground in its mill, baked in its ovens. Each slice is more than food. It is the end of many hours of labor, from sowing seed to grinding flour. Alongside the bread is broth, warm and filling, though never rich. It may hold lentils, leeks, onions, or cabbage, simmered slowly with herbs from the garden. Sometimes, cheese is offered, made from the milk of goats or cows kept nearby. On rare occasions, dried or salted fish appears, a small taste of the sea brought inland by trade. Meat is not part of daily life here. For the monks, eating is not about pleasure, it is about sustenance. The rhythm of the meal continues. Spoons lift and fall. Bread is broken into pieces. Bowls are emptied slowly, steadily. No one hurries, and no one lingers too long. Every action is measured, part of a greater pattern. The silence, filled only with the reader's voice and the ordinary sounds of eating, creates a stillness that feels almost like prayer. To modernize, the meal might appear plain, even austere, but for the monks, it carries a quiet richness. Every element comes from their own hands, their own labor. The bread recalls the fields they sowed, the broth recalls the gardens they tended, the cheese recalls the animals they cared for. Each taste is tied to the rhythm of their life, to the seasons that turn around them, to the patience of steady work. Gratitude rises naturally from this connection. Eating in silence, also, shaped the soul. The monks believed that words could easily lead to distraction, to pride, to idle thought. Silence, on the other hand, kept the heart steady. To eat without talking was to remind themselves that food was a gift, not a pleasure to be wasted in chatter. The meal became an exercise in discipline, just like the prayers and the labors, and in this way, bread and broth carried a deeper meaning. They fed not only the body, but the spirit. The refectory, with its creaking benches and echoing walls, carried its own atmosphere. Imagine sitting there with them. The air is cool, touched by the scent of stone and wood. Sunlight glances across the table, catching the curve of a wooden bowl. The reader's voice flows steadily, while all around, men lift bread to their lips in silence. The sound of chewing, of spoons scraping bowls, is almost musical, a rhythm as old as the monastery itself. When the meal is finished, the monks do not rise at once. They wait for the reader to end his passage, for the abbot's signal, for the small order that concludes the act. Then, together, they bow their heads in thanks. Gratitude is spoken not in long words, but in a brief prayer, a gesture of humility. The bowls are gathered, the tables wiped, the benches pushed back into place. The hall empties slowly, quietly, until once again it stands in stillness, waiting for the next meal. This cycle repeats day after day. Bread, broth, and quiet meals carry the monks through the seasons. In summer, the vegetables are fresh, the herbs strong and fragrant. In winter, the fare is simpler dried beans, stored grains, perhaps turnips from the cellar. The bread may harden with cold, but it is still precious, still shared with the same calm devotion. There is no feast here, except on the rare days of celebration. And even then, the meals remain humble compared to the outside world. Yet for the monks, this simplicity was never a burden. It was a form of freedom. By eating less, by expecting little, they freed themselves from hunger for luxury. By eating in silence, they freed themselves from the noise of idle talk. By eating together, they bound themselves in community. The refectory was more than a dining hall. It was a place where the monastery became one body, sharing one rhythm, one silence, one table. As the meal ends and the monks return to their tasks, the memory of bread and broth lingers. Their bodies are nourished, their spirits steadied. The silence remains with them, carried into the gardens, the workshops, the fields. The monastery lives not by grand events, but by these small, repeating patterns. Prayer, work, and meals together, they form the fabric of a life both ordinary and extraordinary. And so, bread and broth are not forgotten things. They are symbols of the quiet endurance of monastic life, of the steady turning of days under the slow rise and fall of bells. Each meal, though plain, holds within it the strength to carry the monks through prayer, through labor, through seasons of frost and sun. In the stillness of the refectory, with its rows of wooden tables and shafts of morning light, we glimpse not just food, but the rhythm of an entire world, slow, steady, and filled with quiet meaning. The monastery lives not only in prayer and in gardens, nor only in bread and broth, but also in ink, parchment, and patient hands. While the morning light warms the fields outside, another kind of work begins indoors. It takes place in one of the quietest rooms of the monastery, and perhaps one of the most important, the scriptorium. Here, under the dim glow of flickering candles, the monks dedicate themselves to the work of writing. To copy a text was to carry forward the memory of the world, to save it from being lost to time. In this chamber, silence holds a heavier weight than almost anywhere else in the monastery. For silence here is not only an act of devotion, it is the very condition that allows the work to continue. Imagine the scriptorium as you enter it in your mind. The stone walls are cool to the touch, lined with narrow windows that allow only slivers of daylight to fall across the wooden desks. Candles rest in iron holders, their flames trembling in the slightest movement of air. The scent of wax blends with the earthy smell of parchment animal skins prepared by careful hands to receive the ink of scripture, histories, and wisdom. Quills, cut from goose feathers, are set out neatly, waiting for use. Small knives rest beside them, used for trimming mistakes from the page. Ink pots sit like tiny pools of shadow, filled with black liquid made from oak galls and iron salts. The room is not grand. It is not decorated for beauty, but for focus. Long benches run the length of the hall, and on them, monks bend over their work. Their habits brush the stone floor, their heads bowed, their hands moving steadily, carefully, without haste. The only sounds are soft, the faint scratching of quills across parchment, the shuffle of a sleeve, the occasional quiet crackle of candle wicks. To copy a single book was no small task. It could take months, sometimes years. Each letter had to be shaped with care, each line measured with patience. A single error might mean scraping the surface of the parchment with a knife, smoothing it, and beginning again. The work demanded not only skill, but endurance. And yet, to the monks, this labor was sacred. To copy a psalm, a gospel, a homily, or even the histories of Rome and Greece, was to enter into conversation with centuries of wisdom. Their pens became a bridge between past and future. Not all pages were plain. While many were written in steady black ink, others bloomed with color. In the margins, monks added illuminations, delicate vines curling into shapes of leaves, flowers, or birds. Golden letters, applied with thin sheets of beaten metal, caught the candlelight and gleamed like sunlight on water. These details were not added for vanity. They were offerings, ways to honor the text itself. To paint a tiny flower in the margin of a psalm was to mirror the beauty of creation on the page. To gild a single letter was to remind the reader of divine light within the words. The monks did not work only for themselves. Each page carried with it the hope of preservation. In an age when books were rare, when a single copy of a text might be the only one in a region, this work meant survival. Without the quiet dedication of the scriptorium, entire traditions of thought might have vanished. The words of Augustine, of Jerome, of Aristotle, of Homer, all might have faded into silence. Instead, here, in the dim candlelight, they were carried forward, line by line, letter by letter, into the future. Time passed differently in the scriptorium. Hours could slip by unnoticed. A monk might arrive in the morning, with the sun still low, and find himself still bent over the page. As evening shadows stretched across the floor, meals broke the rhythm, prayers interrupted the work, but the manuscripts always awaited return. The page was patient. The ink did not rush. The candle burned down slowly, reminding the monk that time, too, was being consumed. To imagine this labor, let us picture a single monk at his desk. His name is forgotten, as most are, but his hands remain visible through the work he left behind. He holds his quill, trimmed carefully with a small knife, and dips it lightly into the ink. He does not scoop too much, for a blot would stain the parchment. He presses the quill to the page, his wrist steady, and begins to write. Each stroke must be deliberate. His letters form in slow rhythm, tall and narrow, shaped by the style of his monastery. His eyes tire, but he blinks and continues. When he errs, he pauses, scrapes the mistake with the edge of his knife, smooths the surface, and begins again. This cycle repeats hundreds, thousands of times. Around him, other monks do the same. Some copy entire books of scripture, others copy commentaries, others prepare blank parchment for later use. The room is bound together not by speech, but by rhythm. The faint scratching of a dozen pens becomes a kind of music, one that requires no listener. In winter, the scriptorium grows colder. The stone walls hold little warmth, and the monks must work in heavy habits, their fingers stiff with chill. Candles burn more brightly then, their light more necessary against the short days. The wax drips slowly, leaving hardened trails along the holders. In summer, The room grows warmer, and sunlight lingers longer. Dust motes float lazily in the beams that fall across the desks. The pace of work does not change. The seasons turn, but the pens continue to move. Sometimes, a special manuscript is commissioned, perhaps a gospel book for a cathedral, or a psalter for a noble patron. These works demand even greater care, their pages filled with illuminations of saints, angels, and intricate designs. The scriptorium then becomes a place of collaboration, with some monks writing, others painting, others binding. The finished book is more than an object. It is a testament to patience, to devotion, to beauty made in silence. Yet most manuscripts are simpler, plain in their letters, with only modest decoration. They are no less important, for each one holds words that might otherwise be lost. The monks did not measure their success in splendor, but in preservation. Every completed page was a victory over forgetting. The act of writing itself was also a meditation. To copy scripture was to dwell upon it, to let each word pass not only through the quill, but through the heart. The repetition of verses became a rhythm of prayer. The physical act of shaping letters became a devotion in itself. In this way, the scriptorium was as holy as the chapel, as sacred as the garden. And when at last a manuscript was finished, bound in leather, clasped with metal, it became part of the monastery's library. Stored on wooden shelves, protected from damp and decay, it joined the growing treasury of knowledge. The monks might not read every book themselves, but they preserved them for others, for travelers, for future generations. The library was a silent gift to the world, built not in stone, but in words. If we linger a little longer in this imagined scriptorium, we can almost feel the atmosphere settle upon us. The quiet is deep, broken only by the small, steady sounds of labor. The light is dim, yet warm, glowing against parchment and gilded letters. The smell of ink, wax, and parchment fills the air, grounding the senses. Each monk, bent over his desk, is part of a larger whole. Together, they carry forward the memory of ages, not through grand deeds, but through patient strokes of ink. The day wanes, and at last the bell calls again. The monks set down their quills, wipe their hands, close their ink. Candles are extinguished one by one, leaving faint trails of smoke. The scriptorium grows darker, until only the last traces of daylight linger in the windows. The monks rise, stretch their stiff limbs, and leave the chamber in silence. Tomorrow, they will return. The pages will wait, as they always do. The work is never finished, for the past is always greater than what has yet been copied. And so, the scriptorium remains, room of silence, of candlelight, of patience. Within its walls, the world's memory was preserved. Within its silence, generations yet unborn were given a gift they would never see being made. The scratching of quills, the glow of golden letters, the patience of forgotten hands, all of it formed a chain of memory, stretching from the dim medieval cloisters into our own time. Even now, when we read ancient texts, when we open a medieval manuscript, we touch the result of that candlelit labor. We see the work of monks whose names are lost, but whose dedication remains. They remind us that history is not only carried by kings and battles, but by quiet men in quiet rooms, writing by candlelight, word by word, into eternity. The monastery was a world within walls. Beyond its gates, fields stretched into the horizon, towns bustled with life, and merchants called out in busy marketplaces. But inside, the rhythm was slower. It was a rhythm shaped not by the market's noise, nor the hammer of the blacksmith's forge, but by bells, prayers, and quiet footsteps. Nowhere was this rhythm felt more deeply than in the cloister, the long, covered walkway that encircled the monastery's central garden. To step into the cloister was to enter a different kind of silence. It was not an empty silence, but a full one, a silence rich with thought, with prayer, with the soft awareness of one's own breath. The cloister was the monastery's heart, both in design and in spirit. Its paths led to the chapel, the dormitory, the refectory, and the scriptorium. Yet it was more than a passageway. It was a place of reflection, a space where monks could walk slowly, their sandals pressing into gravel, their eyes lowered, their minds turned inward. Picture the cloister as it might have been on a mild morning. Stone pillars rose at even intervals, supporting the roof above, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of weather. Between the arches, sunlight spilled into the garden, warming the herbs and casting long shadows across the walkway. Ivy clung to the stone, its tendrils winding patiently upward, while moss softened the lower edges where rain pooled in the winter months. Beneath the arches, the air was cool and shaded, carrying with it the faint scent of lavender and rosemary drifting from the garden. The soundscape of the cloister was gentle. Gravel crunched softly underfoot as monks walked their measured steps. Birds called faintly from the rafters, having found safe corners to nest. A breeze might stir, carrying the rustle of leaves through the garden. Every sound was small, but in silence, each one became distinct: footstep, breath, wind, and birdsong weaving together like a quiet chant. The central garden itself was not merely decorative, it served both beauty and utility. Beds of sage, thyme, chamomile, and fennel grew in neat rows, tended carefully by the monks. These herbs were not only for cooking but also for healing. Chamomile could be brewed into a calming tea. Sage was thought to purify the body and the spirit. Lavender soothed headaches and restless minds. The cloister garden was, in this way, both pharmacy and sanctuary, a place where nature offered its gifts to support the monastic life. Along one side of the walkway, a simple wooden bench might be found. It was unadorned, perhaps rough-hewn, yet it held quiet importance. A monk might pause there after hours in the scriptorium, resting stiff fingers while gazing at the green of the garden. Another might sit after tending bees or chickens, letting his breath steady before returning to prayer. For many, the bench was not a place of idleness, but of contemplation. To sit in silence, to allow the mind to rest as the body did, was itself considered part of the rhythm of devotion. The cloister walks were not hurried. No one rushed along them, for haste was seen as a kind of restlessness. Instead, the monks moved slowly, their steps measured, their pace unchanging whether they were young or old. These walks were opportunities for reflection, times when the scriptures read at dawn could sink more deeply into memory, or when the tasks of the morning could be considered in light of faith. Walking itself became a prayer, a meditation with every step. Imagine, then, a monk walking in silence after the morning's labor. He leaves the garden tools behind, brushes soil from his hands, and steps onto the cloister path. His sandals press into the gravel, each step crunching gently. He does not look about in curiosity, for his eyes remain steady and lowered, but he notices the world nonetheless. He feels the cool shade of the arches. He sees the glimmer of sunlight on the leaves. He hears the faint hum of bees moving between blossoms in the garden. None of this distracts him. It simply accompanies him. The walk itself holds him in its embrace. For some monks, cloister walks were times to recite prayers softly under the breath. Others simply breathed, allowing the rhythm of their footsteps to carry them. There was no rule that every thought must be holy. Instead, the silence created space. Worries about the harvest, concerns for a sick brother, or memories of life before the monastery might rise and fall during these walks. The cloister accepted them all. Within its arches, silence had room enough for every thought. In different seasons, the cloister offered different moods. In spring, the garden burst with green, the herbs pushing up tender leaves, and the air filled with freshness. Monks walking then might feel the renewal of the world reflected in their own spirits. In summer, sunlight poured in bright and hot, and the shade beneath the arches became a welcome relief. The scent of lavender was strongest then, filling the air with sweetness. In autumn, the garden's colors deepened: golden leaves, drying stalks of fennel, the faint earthiness of soil being prepared for winter. The monks walked through falling leaves, hearing them scatter across the stones. In winter, silence deepened even further. Snow sometimes dusted the garden, and cold air pressed through the arches. The monks wrapped their habits more tightly, their steps slower, their breath visible in the cold. Yet even then, the cloister remained a place of peace, its stillness unbroken by the season's hardship. The cloister also carried memory. Monks who had walked here in youth walked again in old age. Their steps grew slower, their bodies frailer, yet the path remained the same. A novice might follow in the footsteps of elders, walking the same gravel paths that had been worn by generations before him. In this way, the cloister became a thread that bound together past, present, and future. It reminded each monk that his life was part of something larger, something that endured beyond his own days. To modernize, the silence of the cloister might seem heavy, perhaps even strange, but for the monks, it was alive. Silence was a language of its own. It spoke not with words, but with presence, with the sound of steps, with the sight of ivy curling upward, with the feel of cool stone beneath one's hand. It reminded them that devotion was not only spoken in prayers or sung in chants, but lived in the body, in walking, in breathing, in noticing. And so, as the day passed, monks returned to the cloister again and again. After meals, they might take short walks to settle their bodies. After hours bent over parchment, they might stretch their limbs beneath the arches. After tending the sick or preparing food, they might pause in the garden's stillness. Each return was like a heartbeat, steady and regular, reminding them of the balance between labor and rest, between action and contemplation. At dusk, the cloister grew more solemn. Shadows lengthened, the arches darkened, and candles glowed faintly in the windows of surrounding buildings. The garden fell quiet as birds tucked themselves into nests. The gravel paths cooled with the evening air. A monk walking then would find the silence deepening into something almost sacred, a hush that seemed to draw the whole monastery toward rest. The cloister, in its quiet way, shaped the life of the monastery as much as the chapel or the refectory. It was not only a place of passage, but a place of presence. It was where silence spoke, where herbs grew, where footsteps fell in steady rhythm. It was where time itself seemed to slow, allowing each moment to expand, to settle, to be carried gently into memory. And even now, when we imagine those cloister walks, we can feel something of that peace. We can hear the faint crunch of gravel. We can smell the lavender in the air. We can see the arches stretching on, one after another, leading us not toward haste, but toward stillness. The cloister teaches us that silence is not emptiness, but fullness, that to walk slowly, to breathe deeply, is to step into a rhythm older than words, older even than memory itself. The day in a medieval monastery unfolded, not according to clocks or busy schedules, but to the steady toll of bells. Each bell was like a heartbeat, gently dividing the hours, softly reminding the community of monks that time was not theirs to command, but to receive, moment by moment. By noon, after a morning of labor and quiet devotion, the bell once again called them together, summoning them to prayer beneath the cool arches of their chapel. It is worth pausing to consider what those bells meant. In our own world, bells often ring in alarm, in celebration, or to announce something urgent. But in the monastery, the bells were steady, calm, and constant. They did not cry out for attention, but guided it. For the monks, each ring was not a disruption, but a reminder that life was more than tasks, more than food, more than even the day's labor. Life, for them, was always turned toward the eternal. The bell's voice was the monastery's compass, calling them, again and again, back to their center. The great bell itself hung high in a tower, suspended by wooden beams darkened by age and smoke. Its surface bore marks of time, streaks of weather, patches of rust, but when struck, it sang with clarity, its tone deep and resonant. The sound rolled across the fields, echoing through the stone cloisters, reaching even the outer edges of the monastery's farmland. Farmers nearby could hear it. Travelers on the road might hear it too, and for a moment, they would know that prayers were rising within those walls. Inside the monastery, the sound spread like ripples. A monk working in the garden would pause, setting aside his tools. Another, bent over parchment in the scriptorium, would gently blot his page and lay down his quill. In the kitchen, where vegetables simmered in iron pots, the cook would step back, wipe his hands, and turn toward the chapel. Everywhere, the bell was obeyed, not out of fear, but out of devotion. The monks' lives belonged to something larger than themselves, and the bell was its voice. Walking now toward the chapel, the monks moved slowly but with purpose. Their habits of undyed wool brushed against the stone passages, the cloth heavy but familiar. Sandals struck the floor in steady rhythm, echoing softly in the corridors. The air grew cooler as they approached the great doors of the chapel, and the faint scent of beeswax and old stone drifted outward to meet them. Entering the chapel, they stepped into a space designed to hold both silence and sound. The walls rose high, vaulting overhead, their stones fitted together with patient craftsmanship. Light fell through narrow windows, colored faintly by stained glass that depicted saints, vines, or simple crosses. The air was cool, always cooler here than outside, for thick stone held the chill even in summer. Candles flickered in iron holders, their flames small but steady, their smoke carrying the faint sweetness of beeswax. The monks took their places in the choir stalls, long wooden seats carved with simple care. They stood together, lined in rows, their faces calm, their eyes lowered. Then, as the bell fell silent, another sound rose, chanting. It began low, almost like a murmur, one voice steady, others joining. The notes rose and fell without haste, each phrase flowing into the next, like the movement of water. The words were not shouted, not rushed, but carried in measured rhythm, echoing through the vaulted arches above. The chant filled the space, not with noise, but with harmonia, weaving of voices that seemed to make the very stones vibrate with devotion. This midday prayer, sometimes called sext, was not long, nor was it elaborate. It did not need to be. The point was not performance, but rhythm, the return, again and again, to the center of the monastic life. As the chant rose, monks felt the weight of the morning lift, replaced by a quieter strength. The world outside, with its wars, its merchants, its endless noise, faded for a time. Here, within these walls, there was only voice, breath, stone, and silence held together by prayer. When the last note of chanting dissolved into air, silence returned as naturally as dusk follows day. The monks bowed their heads, each offering quiet prayer, and then, as calmly as they had entered, they rose again. Their movements were unhurried, their sandals brushing against the floor as they stepped back into the corridors. The service had ended, but the sound lingered, carried within each monk like an ember. They returned to their tasks not empty, but steadied, their hearts tuned once again to peace. It is easy to imagine this moment repeated day after day, year after year. The bell would ring, the monks would gather, the chant would rise, and then silence would return. Some might wonder if such repetition became dull, but for the monks, it was the opposite. Each return was renewal. The sameness itself was comforting, like the rising of the sun or the turning of the seasons. The bell reminded them that life was not about constant novelty, but about steady devotion, about returning again and again to what mattered most. Outside, after prayers, the day continued. A monk might return to the fields, bending to pull weeds among the vegetables. Another might step back into the scriptorium, lifting his quill and resuming the steady labor of copying. In the kitchen, pots simmered once more, the cook returning to his broth, yet all of it was touched by the bell. Its sound still echoed faintly in their memory, shaping even the smallest task with quiet reverence. In the heat of summer, the midday bell carried a special weight. The sun would be high, pressing down on the fields, the air heavy and still. Farmers outside might pause, wiping sweat from their brows, as the bell rolled across the countryside. For them too, it was a marker, a moment of stillness in the midst of labor. Within the monastery walls, the cool chapel offered relief, a place where the weight of heat lifted for a time, replaced by shadows, stone, and song. In winter, the bell carried differently. Snow might blanket the fields, muting the land in quiet whiteness. The bell's sound would seem sharper then, clearer against the frozen air. Monks wrapped in heavy cloaks would move quickly through the cold corridors, breath clouding before them, glad for the warmth of the chapel's candles. The chant in those seasons was even more precious. Its warmth not only spiritual but physical, a reminder of light within darkness. There is something deeply human in this rhythm of bells. It speaks to a need we all share, the need to pause, to reorient, to remember. In our own days, filled with endless noise and constant demands, we too might find comfort in something that simply calls us back, again and again, to stillness. For the monks, the bell was that voice, steady, unwavering, patient. It marked not just time, but eternity. As the afternoon stretched on, the monks carried with them the quiet strength of their prayer. The bell would sound again later, at different hours, each ring shaping the day like stones set in a wall. But the midday bell had its own special place. It divided morning from afternoon, labor from rest, silence from song. It was a pivot point, a moment when all the monastery turned together toward the eternal, before returning, gently, to the ordinary. And so, the monastery's life moved forward, as it always did, not in haste, not in noise, but in steady rhythm. The bell would ring, the monks would gather, the chant would rise, and silence would return. A cycle repeated, not for a year or a decade, but for centuries. Even now, if you stand among the ruins of an old abbey, you can almost hear its deep toll of the bell, rolling across fields, calling the faithful to pause, to breathe, to turn again toward peace. The monastery garden was more than soil and plants. It was a living heart within the cloister walls, a place where necessity and solace met in quiet companionship. Here, in the patterned rows of beans and onions, in the spreading cabbages, in the delicate stems of mint and fennel, monks found both food for the body and nourishment for the spirit. The garden was never loud, never hurried. Its rhythm was the rhythm of nature itself, slow, patient, and faithful. At dawn, when dew clung to every leaf like glass beads, the garden seemed to breathe with a freshness all its own. Mist often lingered low over the cabbages, while the faint scent of damp earth rose from the soil that had been turned with care the day before. Birds fluttered to the garden wall, their small claws tapping softly against stone, while bees, as if half asleep, began their early wanderings among the blossoms. The monks, in their simple habits, entered quietly, tools in hand. They bent low over the rows, their movements unhurried, as if each weed pulled or seed sown was part of a prayer too subtle for words. The tools they used were simple wooden-handled hoes, iron spades worn smooth from years of work, watering pots shaped from clay. Nothing was wasted, nothing elaborate. The garden did not demand invention, only faithfulness. Each season called for its own labors: spring for planting, summer for weeding and tending, autumn for harvesting, and winter for resting the land. The monks followed these cycles not as masters of the soil, but as its caretakers. They knew that growth came not by force but by patience, by watching, and by aligning their work with the deeper rhythm of nature. The garden was divided with care. Rows of vegetables stretched in neat lines, beans climbing poles, onions forming green spikes, leeks with their long stalks, and broad cabbages resting heavy on the earth. Nearby, smaller beds held herbs, mint for refreshing teas, fennel for both food and medicine, sage and thyme for flavoring the modest meals of the refectory. Lavender, chamomile, and rosemary grew too, their scents rising sweetly in summer, their blossoms alive with bees. These herbs were not only for cooking but for healing. In the infirmary, monks tended the sick with poultices, teas, and salves prepared from these very plants. Thus, every leaf had meaning, every root a purpose. Working here was never just about survival. The monks saw the garden as a reflection of creation itself, a small echo of Eden preserved within their walls. To till the soil was to participate in a divine rhythm, to care for what had been entrusted to them. They labored not in complaint but in quiet devotion, their hands in the soil as their minds rested in prayer. Even the smallest act, or a row of seedlings, trimming back overgrown herbs, infused with a sense of reverence. As they worked, silence prevailed. The scrape of a hoe, the soft thud of a spade meeting earth, the trickle of water from a clay jug, these were the sounds that filled the garden. Sometimes a bird would call, or the wind would stir the leaves, and these too became part of the monastery's music. The silence was not empty, but full, carrying with it the weight of presence and attention. For the monks, silence in the garden was as meaningful as silence in the chapel. Through the seasons, the garden told its own story. In spring, green shoots broke through the soil, fragile but insistent. The monks tended them carefully, protecting them from late frosts, watering them when rains were scarce. Summer brought fullness, when every row seemed alive, vegetables ripening beneath broad leaves, herbs bursting with fragrance. The monks worked steadily, weeding and pruning, keeping the garden neat yet never rigid. Autumn was a time of gathering, when baskets filled with cabbages, beans, and onions made their way to the kitchens. And in winter, when frost hardened the soil and snow lay across the beds, the garden rested. Even then, it was not abandoned, but watched over, a reminder that patience always led to renewal. Insects and animals, too, shared this space. Bees moved lazily from flower to flower, their buzzing soft and steady. Butterflies drifted across the beds, their wings flashing briefly in sunlight. Birds hopped along the paths, searching for insects. Sometimes a rabbit might venture near, or a field mouse, and though these were not always welcome, they were accepted as part of the order of life. The monks did not see themselves as alone in their work, but as part of a web where each creature had its place. The garden also offered the monks a place of quiet healing. Those who were weary from study or labor could walk its paths, breathe in its scents, and feel their spirits restored. A bench set beneath a tree might provide a moment's rest, where one could listen to the bees or watch the play of light on leaves. For some monks, the garden became a place of contemplation, where the steady cycles of growth and decay mirrored their own spiritual journey. Seeds buried in darkness, sprouting unseen, pushing toward light. Such images spoke deeply of faith, perseverance, and the hope of renewal. In the infirmary, the fruits of the garden's labor became remedies. Mint might ease the stomach, chamomile calm the restless, sage soothe the sore throat. Salves made from lavender or rosemary might heal wounds, while fennel seeds aided digestion. These remedies were simple, yet for centuries they sustained health and eased pain. To the monks, every healing leaf was a gift, a reminder that creation itself held the means of restoration. Yet beyond its practical uses, the garden was a teacher. It taught patience, for growth could not be hurried. It taught humility, for even the most careful tending could not guarantee harvest without rain and sun. It taught gratitude, for every ripe cabbage or sprig of thyme was received, not as entitlement but as blessing. And it taught community, for no single monk could manage the garden alone. Together they planted, together they harvested, and together they gave thanks. At midday, when bells called them to prayer, the monks would leave their tools where they lay and walk slowly toward the chapel. The garden would rest in silence, its rows of vegetables standing watchful in the sun, bees still weaving their steady paths. After prayers, the monks would return, resuming their tasks as if no time had passed, the rhythm unbroken. In this way, the garden and the chapel wove together, each sanctifying the other. Labor and prayer, earth and spirit, necessity and devotion. Evening brought its own beauty. As the sun lowered, golden light fell across the leaves, casting long shadows between the rows. The air cooled, carrying the mingled scents of herbs warmed through the day. The monks finished their work, tools cleaned and stored, baskets carried to the kitchens. The garden, tended and cared for, seemed to rest along with its keepers. Crickets began their song, and bats flickered overhead in search of insects. The silence deepened, settling like a blanket across soil and stone. Centuries later, many monastery gardens have vanished, yet in ruins and records, their outlines remain: a stone wall enclosing a patch of earth, a mention of herbs used for medicine, a drawing of neat rows of vegetables. These fragments remind us that the garden was not just an afterthought, but a vital part of monastic life. It fed the body, healed the sick, and offered solace to the soul. It was as sacred in its own way as the scriptorium or the chapel. If you stand today in such a place, among old stones where ivy climbs and birds sing, you may feel something of that old rhythm, the sense that life, at its heart, is slow, patient, and faithful, that tending the earth is not only work but devotion, that even the smallest garden can hold within it a reflection of something eternal. The monks knew this. With every row they planted, every herb they gathered, every quiet hour they spent beneath the sky, they lived a truth still waiting for us to hear, that to tend a garden is to tend life itself. And so the monastery garden, with its beans and onions, its mint and sage, its bees and birds, was never merely a place of food. It was a place of persistence, of patience, and of prayer. A reminder, year after year, that life continues, gently, faithfully, no matter the season. Beneath the monastery, where sunlight rarely reached, there was another world, quiet, cool, and dim. The stone steps led downward into cellars and storerooms, places where the monks kept what they had gathered and made, places that carried the smell of earth, of damp stone, and of wood that had darkened with age. These were not halls of splendor or beauty, but they were just as essential as the chapel above. For here, hidden away in the half-light, lay the provisions that would keep the community alive through long winters, poor harvests, and seasons of scarcity. Entering such a cellar was like entering the belly of the monastery itself. The air was cooler, holding a faint moisture that never seemed to lift. The thick walls of stone, built for strength, kept the space steady in temperature, neither too warm in summer nor too cold in winter. The floor was often uneven, made of packed earth or stone, and one could hear the soft drip of water in far corners. The monks moved slowly here, their sandals making a dull sound against the floor, their habits brushing against wooden shelves and barrels. Rows of barrels lined the walls, great wooden casks bound with iron hoops, filled with ale brewed. In the monastery, brewing was a skill passed down from one generation of monks to another, not for pleasure alone, but for sustenance. In times when water was unsafe to drink, ale provided nourishment. and its storage in barrels meant that it could last for months. Turning the barrels was part of the cellar work, a simple yet necessary task to keep the contents even, to prevent spoiling. Each barrel represented not only drink, but survival, especially in the coldest months when fresh water might freeze and food was scarce. Nearby stood shelves heavy with jars and sacks. Dried beans filled coarse cloth bags, stacked neatly one upon the other. Grain, wheat, barley, oats were stored in both sacks and wooden bins, their surfaces dusted with fine powder. These grains would become bread, the daily food that sustained the monarchy. Alongside them were salted fish, cured and packed carefully to resist decay, their smell faint but unmistakable in the cool air. Dried fruits, apples, pears, plums were strung together or wrapped in cloth, preserved from harvests past. Every item had its place, and every place had its order. The cellar was no chaos of storage, but a careful, deliberate arrangement. The monks worked here quietly, as they did everywhere. One might lift a sack of beans to a higher shelf, another might check a jar of preserved fruit, ensuring the cloth wrapping was still dry and secure. Another would inspect the barrels, listening for the hollow sound of weakness in the wood, tightening iron hoops where needed. The labor was not heavy, not dramatic, but it was patient, and patience was the spirit of the cellar. For what was kept here was never for immediate use, but for days, weeks, and months ahead. The scent of the storeroom was layered, the sharp salt of fish, the earthy smell of beans and grain, the sweetness of dried apples, the must of damp stone. For a newcomer, it might feel oppressive, but for the monks, it was familiar, comforting even. These smells meant safety. They meant that no matter how harsh the winds outside, no matter how long the snow lay heavy on the ground, the monastery would endure. Working in the cellar taught a quiet kind of wisdom. The monks knew that survival did not depend only on prayer or labor in the fields, but on foresight. What was set aside in autumn determined what could be endured in winter. And so every sack stacked neatly, every jar sealed tightly, every barrel carefully rolled into place was an act of preparation. The cellar was a book of patience, written in beans and salt, in wood and stone. Candles burned dimly here, their light soft against the walls. Shadows leaned across shelves, and the flicker of flame danced across the curved sides of barrels. The monks carried these candles with care, for flame was both necessary and dangerous in such places. Too much light was not needed, only enough to see the work at hand. Their faces glowed in the candlelight, the lines of age and the simplicity of devotion softened by the warm glow. Sometimes, as they worked, they would pause. A monk might run his hand across a barrel, feeling the rough grain of the wood beneath his fingers, or lift a sack slightly to test its weight. Such gestures were not idle. They were part of the rhythm of care, of making sure that nothing was forgotten, that all was in readiness. The cellar also held herbs, dried and bundled, hanging from beams or tied with twine along the walls. These were gathered from the monastery garden: sage, thyme, rosemary, lavender, and preserved for both food and medicine. Their fragrance lingered even in the damp air, small reminders of sunlight and fields above. In the depths of winter, when illness came, these herbs would be steeped into teas, ground into salves, or crumbled into broth. Thus, even in the shadowy cellar, the presence of the garden was felt. For the monks, work in the cellar was more than storing food. It was an act of trust. To place beans in a jar, to hang fish salted on hooks, to seal a barrel of ale, act was a promise to the future, a quiet assurance that spring would come again. It was also an act of humility, for no matter how carefully they stored and prepared, all depended on the seasons, on the harvests, on the grace that allowed the earth to yield its fruit. In the silence of these storerooms, one could almost hear the weight of time itself. The monks' breaths echoed faintly, and their movements seemed slower, more deliberate, as if the cellar itself asked for quiet. The cool air pressed close, holding its secrets. To walk among the barrels and shelves was to walk among months yet to come, to step into the monastery's future. When the work was done, the monks would ascend again, carrying baskets or sacks. Up the stone steps, the candle flames flickering as they moved toward the light above. The cellars would fall silent once more, holding their treasures in stillness, waiting. In this way, the monastery endured not by chance, but by care, by the humble, hidden labor of storing, preserving, preparing. Centuries later, ruins of still reveal such places. Cellars carved beneath cloisters, storerooms built of stone, shelves and hooks etched into the walls. Even when empty, these spaces speak of their old purpose. One can almost imagine the smell of ale, the salt of fish, the damp of stone. One can imagine the monks moving there, slowly, carefully, trusting that what they did in silence would carry their community through dark and difficult days. The cellar and storerooms were not grand. They held no beauty like stained glass, no music like the chapel, no brilliance like the scriptorium's illuminated pages. Yet they were vital. They were places of hidden strength, where patience and foresight became as holy as prayer. To work here was to serve not only the present, but the future, and in the rhythm of turning barrels, stacking jars, and arranging sacks of grain, the monks lived out their devotion in a form as lasting as stone itself. And so, beneath the monastery, life was prepared in silence. Ale rested in its barrels, beans in their sacks, herbs in their bundles, fruits in their wrappings, all waiting, all preserved, all guarded. And above, life went on, bells ringing, prayers rising, gardens growing. Together, the two worlds above and below, light and shadow, present and future, sustained one another, each made whole by the other. The cellar whispered, not of urgency, but of patience. It reminded the monks, and reminds us still, that survival depends on small acts, done faithfully, with care and foresight. In those cool, dim storerooms, beneath the echo of stone, the monks, taught by their labor that preparation is itself a form of devotion, and that even in the quietest, most hidden corners, life is being safeguarded. Within the monastery, there was always a place set aside for those whose strength had faltered. This was the infirmary. It was not large or grand, but it was tender, carefully arranged, and quietly respected. Its walls were plain, its windows narrow, letting in muted light. The air inside carried a blend of scents: lavender, mint, dried rosemary, and the faint sweetness of honey. To step into this space was to step into a gentler rhythm of life, where labor gave way to rest, and where suffering was met not with fear, but with patience. The infirmary stood close to the heart of the cloister, yet it seemed a world apart. Its rooms were hushed, lined with wooden beds covered in coarse but clean linen. Each bed was simple, nothing more than a frame of oak or pine, but each was attended with care. Warm blankets, often woven by the monks themselves, offered comfort against the chill of stone walls. At the foot of every bed was a small stool or table, holding a clay cup of water or a small bowl of herbs steeping in hot liquid. The monk charged with this duty was known as the infirmarier. He was not a physician in the modern sense, but he was a man who had learned the uses of herbs, the signs of sickness, and the quiet art of comfort. His role was both practical and spiritual. With one hand he might adjust a blanket or prepare a salve, while with the other he might offer a prayer or simply rest it upon a shoulder. His presence was steady, patient, and calm. Remedies were simple, drawn from the monastery's garden and storerooms. Honey, thick and golden, was applied to wounds, its natural sweetness protecting against decay. Chamomile flowers dried in the summer sun were steeped in warm water to ease troubled sleep. Mint leaves were crushed to calm the stomach, while fennel seeds were chewed for digestion. Lavender, tied in small bundles, was hung by bedsides to soothe the spirit with its gentle fragrance. Nothing was wasted, and nothing was extravagant. Healing was done with what the earth provided, guided by knowledge handed down from monk to monk, from elder to novice. The infirmary did not ring with the clamor of voices. Instead, it breathed with quiet sounds, the soft rustle of linen, the occasional cough, the murmur of prayer. Candles burned low, their light golden and calm, casting gentle shadows against whitewashed walls. A wooden cross might hang above the room, a reminder that suffering, too, had its place in the story of life. For the monks, illness was not an enemy to be fought with anger, but a burden to be carried with grace. To be sick was to be reminded of human frailty, yet also of human community. A monk who lay weak upon his bed was not abandoned. Brothers came to his side, offering water, a hand to hold, or simply their presence in silence. Compassion was the medicine most freely given, and perhaps the most deeply healing. It was not only monks who found rest in these walls. Travelers, the poor, orphans, and the weary might also be taken in. Medieval monasteries often stood as beacons of shelter, offering not only food and drink, but care for the body. A weary pilgrim, limping from the road, might be given a bed and a warm compress. For his aching feet, A motherless child, thin and pale, might be fed broth and watched over with the same kindness given to a brother of the order. In such ways, the infirmary reached beyond the cloister, touching lives that might otherwise have been left to suffering. The work here was slow, often repetitive, and filled with waiting. Healing did not come quickly, and sometimes it did not come at all. Some who entered these walls never walked out again. But even in death, the monastery's care continued. The sick were not left alone in their final hours. The infirmary or another brother would remain nearby, reading softly from scripture or whispering prayers into the stillness. The dying man would be accompanied, carried by words of hope and the presence of his community. For the monks, to ease another's final journey was as sacred as to mend his wounds. There was a rhythm to the infirmary, one that matched the slow pace of nature. Morning began with warm water, herbs prepared, beds straightened. Through the day, the infirmary moved from one patient to another, checking fevers, refreshing poultices, offering small meals of broth or bread softened in milk. By evening, the room grew quiet again, the sick resting in candlelight, their breathing steady, their dreams guided perhaps by the scent of lavender placed upon their pillows. The infirmary was not only a place of medicine, but of teaching. Novice monks would sometimes assist, learning the uses of herbs, the patience of tending, the humility of serving. They learned that healing was not a matter of grand cures, but of small, steady acts, refilling a cup, straightening a blanket, offering a word of comfort at the right moment. In such acts, they learned compassion not from books, but from life itself. Outside, the seasons shifted, but inside the infirmary, time seemed slower. In winter, fires were kept burning in small hearths to push back the cold. In summer, windows were opened to let in fresh air, the scent of fields drifting in. Yet always, the air inside remained tinged with herbs and candle wax, a blend that seemed to belong only to this place. For the sick, the infirmary was a place of vulnerability, but also of safety. Here, weakness was not judged. A brother too frail to rise for morning prayers was not condemned, but tended. A pilgrim too weary to walk another mile was not turned away, but given rest. This was the true gift of the monastery, not the curing of every illness, but the offering of dignity, compassion, and care. Centuries later, the ruins of monasteries still carry traces of these places. Stone rooms that once held wooden beds, windows where herbs once dried in the sun, walls that once heard whispered prayers. Standing in such ruins, one can almost sense the presence of the infirmary, moving gently among the weary, carrying a bowl of warm broth, or adjusting a blanket. The echo of compassion lingers, even when the walls are silent. The monastery infirmary reminds us that healing is more than medicine. It is presence, patience, and kindness. It is the slow rhythm of care, given without demand, received with gratitude. In a world often marked by hardship, famine, and war, these quiet rooms stood as places of peace, where suffering was met not with neglect, but with tenderness, and so, the care of the sick and weary became part of the monk's devotion, as holy as prayer, as lasting as stone. For in every herb applied, in every blanket laid, in every hand held, they lived out their vow of service, not only to God, but to one another, and to every soul who passed through their gates in need of rest. By the time the sun began its slow descent, the monastery had already lived through many hours of prayer, work, and silence. Noon prayers were behind them, the ringing of bells still lingering in memory. The fields and gardens had been tended, meals eaten, manuscripts copied, and tasks carried out with patient attention. Yet the day was not over. The hours of afternoon stretched quietly, like golden threads woven into the fabric of time, carrying with them a mood both restful and reflective. It was in the afternoon that shadows began to grow longer across the cloisters. The sun, tilting westward, cast slanted beams of light through narrow arches and stone passageways. On the worn gravel paths, those beams broke into patterns, forming a delicate lattice of light and shade. A monk walking here would seem to move in and out of another world, half in sun, half in shadow, as though time itself was pausing to admire the play of light. The cloister walls, which had stood for generations, received this light as they always had, silently, patiently, their surfaces glowing pale gold before fading again into grey. Afternoons in the monastery were neither idle nor hurried. They held a gentle rhythm, slower than morning's labors but no less meaningful. Some monks took this time to mend tools, simple wooden handles that had splintered, iron blades that needed sharpening, or rope that had frayed with use. In the workshop, the sound of filing, the steady scrape of stone against metal, and the muted thump of a hammer could be heard. These were not the sounds of industry in the modern sense, but of small, careful repairs, each stroke deliberate, each task approached with quiet purpose. Others turned to garments, monastic habits, woven from coarse wool, wore thin over time. Elbows grew shiny, hems unraveled, seams pulled apart with daily wear. The monks who took needle and thread in hand did not complain of the tedium. To mend a garment was to restore order, to prolong usefulness, to show gratitude for what had been given. Sitting by the light of a high window, a monk would move the needle slowly, steadily, binding fabric back together with patient stitches. Outside, the light shifted. Inside, the rhythm of repair continued, unbroken. For some, afternoons were spent in the laundry. Washing garments was no small task. Cloister wells provided water, cold and clear, drawn up in heavy wooden buckets. Soap was made not of perfumes or oils, but from ashes mixed with fat, coarse yet effective. Monks scrubbed their habits by hand, the fabric heavy with water, their fingers reddened by the chill. Yet even here, the work was approached as prayer. Each scrub, each wringing of cloth, was done with steadiness, with a heart oriented not toward complaint, but toward patience. Once washed, garments were laid over wooden racks or draped upon bushes in the garden, where wind and sun dried them with quiet efficiency. Not every monk worked with his hands during this time. Some rested, sitting in silence beneath the cloisters, their minds turned inward. A bench beneath the ivy offered a seat, a stone step, a place to pause. They might gaze into the garden, watching bees move between blossoms, or simply close their eyes, listening to the faint murmur of leaves stirring in the wind. Rest was not idleness, it was reflection, a chance to let the soul settle after the labors of the day. The kitchen, too, grew busy in these hours. Fires were tended carefully, wood added to hearths so the flames would not falter. The air filled with the faint smoke of oak and beech, mingling with the scents of herbs and vegetables simmering in pots. Afternoon cooking was not elaborate, but it was steady. Broths were stirred, bread prepared for the evening meal, and herbs added for flavor and nourishment. The warmth of the kitchen spread outward, and those who passed nearby might catch a faint whiff of rosemary or thyme carried on the air. The afternoons were also times of preparation for the seasons ahead. In summer and autumn, monks preserved food for the winter months, drying apples, salting fish, storing beans and peas in sacks. In the cellar, barrels were checked, lids tightened, jars stacked neatly upon shelves. Each small act was part of the monastery's rhythm of survival. Afternoon shadows reminded them that just as day passed into night, so too did summer pass into winter. To prepare was not only wise, but essential. Silence often deepened in these hours. The monastery seemed to exhale, its walls cooling as the sun withdrew its strength. Birds settled on the rooftops, their calls softer now than in the morning. The wind carried scents of earth and stone, of damp wood and fading flowers. It was as though the very air understood that the day was nearing its close, and urged the monks toward stillness. Yet within this stillness, there was profound meaning. The monks did not see afternoon as wasted time. Even the smallest labor was imbued with dignity. To mend a tool, to fold a garment, to carry a bucket of water, each action was seen as service, as prayer enacted through the body. The long shadows themselves seemed to remind the monks of life's passing hours, urging them not to chase achievement, but to accept the beauty of the present moment. As the sun dipped lower, beams of golden light poured across the gardens, painting the herbs and vegetables in warm hues. Cabbages gleamed softly, their broad leaves catching the sun. Rows of beans cast thin shadows, delicate lines across the soil. In the orchard, fruit glowed like small lanterns, touched by the last brightness of the day. For the monks, to look upon these sights was itself a form of contemplation. The earth gave generously, and the afternoon light revealed its gifts with tenderness. In the cloister walks, monks strolled slowly, sandals crunching on gravel. Their steps were unhurried, their faces calm. Some carried books, pausing to read a passage before continuing their walk. Others folded their hands into their sleeves, content simply to breathe in the cooling air. The cloister was more than a passageway, it was a living heart of the monastery, and in the afternoon it became a place of meditation. Each turnaround its square seemed to echo with centuries of quiet footsteps, with prayers whispered and thoughts unspoken. Occasionally, the infirmary called during these hours. A monk tending the sick might prepare a fresh draught of herbs, change linens, or sit by a weary brother's side. Afternoon light streamed faintly through narrow windows, falling across pale faces and resting hands. Even here, in places of weakness, the day's rhythm unfolded with gentle continuity. Healing, like the slow passing of hours, required patience. As the day wore on, the air began to cool. Shadows lengthened further, stretching across fields and walls like fingers of dusk. The sky deepened in color, shifting from gold to soft amber, from amber to muted gray. The monastery seemed to settle, as though drawing a long breath before evening. The bells had not yet rung, but already the community felt the pull toward the chapel, toward prayer, toward the calm closure of another day. The long shadows of afternoon carried with them a reminder. All things pass, light fades, strength wanes, tasks are completed, and yet in the passing there is peace. For the monks, this truth was not troubling but reassuring. Just as the sun returned each morning, so too would it set each evening. The cycle was steady, dependable, trustworthy. In embracing this rhythm, the monks embraced life itself, with all its endings and beginnings. By the time the first cool breath of evening touched the stones, the monastery was at rest. The work was finished, garments drying, tools mended, meals prepared. The garden lay quiet, the cloister hushed. The long shadows slowly gave way to twilight, and with them came a profound sense of completion. The day's labors had been enough. Silence deepened, waiting for the next toll of the bell, which would draw all back together in prayer. And so the afternoons ended, not with fanfare, but with calm, as steady as the slow turning of the earth. Within the monastery, peace was not found in grand gestures, but in the ordinary light falling on stone, the quiet mend of a seam, the soft rustle of garments drying in the breeze. The long shadows of afternoon were not only the end of day, they were the monastery's gentle reminder that in every ending there is beauty, and in every pause, a chance to breathe deeply and give thanks. When the day had nearly folded into night, when shadows had lengthened into full darkness, and the monastery had grown hushed with the approach of evening, the monks gathered once more in the refectory. This was the second and final meal of the day. Unlike the noonday meal, often taken in full light, this gathering was softened by fire and candle, by quiet shadows and a deep sense of closure. The walls of the refectory, bare yet dignified, absorbed the glow of flame and the murmurs of ritual, offering shelter for bodies weary from labor and souls steady from prayer. Evening was not a time of feasting. No abundance of meats or rich foods was placed upon the tables. Instead, bowls of pottage thick stew prepared from grains, vegetables, and legumes were carried in, their steam rising faintly in the cool air. A loaf of bread, coarse but sustaining, accompanied the stew, and perhaps, on occasion, a small portion of cheese or dried fish. The fare was simple, pared down to essentials, yet simplicity was not seen as lack. It was seen as discipline, as gratitude, as the humble acceptance of sustenance given by the earth and prepared by patient hands. The monks sat in long rows at heavy wooden tables, their seats worn smooth by years of use. Firelight from the hearth at the far end of the room flickered across their faces, illuminating lines of fatigue, quiet expressions of contentment, and the unbroken stillness of men accustomed to silence. Shadows stretched behind them, flickering in rhythm with the flames, as though the walls themselves were breathing in time with the meal. Meals in the monastery were never occasions for chatter. Conversation was forbidden. The refectory was an extension of prayer, a place where the act of eating was joined to the rhythm of devotion. Silence hung in the room like a mantle, not oppressive, but grounding, shaping the meal into something more than physical nourishment. In that silence, the scrape of wooden spoons against bowls seemed louder, the creak of benches sharper, the crackle of fire clearer. Each sound was distinct, each part of the greater harmony. Breaking the silence, however, was the voice of the appointed reader. At every meal, one monk stood at a lectern positioned so that all might hear. By the dim glow of a single candle, or by the hearth's fire, he read aloud from sacred text scripture, writings of the church fathers, or perhaps the rule of Saint Benedict itself. The cadence of his voice was slow and steady, rising and falling like waves upon a shore. His words carried across the hall, filling the air not with chatter, but with reflection. It was a peculiar union, the voice of one blending with the silence of many. The monks ate in stillness, yet their minds were fed by words, just as their bodies were fed by bread and stew. The reading reminded them that nourishment was not only physical but spiritual, that every act of daily life could be tied back to a higher purpose. To chew a piece of bread while listening to scripture was in its way to join two hungers, the hunger of flesh and the hunger of solenta, one quiet satisfaction. The refectory itself was designed for such evenings. Its long hall, built of stone, held the warmth of fire and the weight of stillness. Above, rafters stretched into shadow, their timbers darkened by years of smoke. Candles flickered in iron sconces along the walls, their small flames casting halos of light that danced and swayed. The scent of wood smoke mingled with that of the meal. Onions, leeks, beans, and herbs simmered together, with a hint of rosemary or thyme carried through the air. It was not the smell of luxury, but of comfort, of hearth and home, of labor rewarded by the simplest of gifts. As bowls were passed down the table, each monk received his portion without hurry. There was no clamor, no reaching for more than one's share. All was distributed fairly, measured carefully, enough for each and no more. Gratitude was expressed not in words, but in posture. In the careful way each monk bowed his head before lifting spoon to mouth. Eating was not indulgence, it was participation in a shared life, a recognition that sustenance was meant to be received humbly, as gift, not seized as possession. The firelight drew eyes, especially in the darker months when night came early and the wind pressed cold against the stone walls. To watch the flames was to watch time itself, passing logs, settling into ash, sparks leaping and vanishing, light flickering and fading. The monks did not stare idly, but the presence of fire had its own calming power. It reminded them of warmth, of continuity, of life sustained against the darkness beyond the walls. The rhythm of the meal was slow, steady. No one rushed, yet no one lingered. Each monk ate what was given, spoonful after spoonful, the steady scraping of bowls forming a background to the reader's voice. The fire snapped and popped. The benches groaned beneath shifting weight. A cough here, the sound of bread crust breaking there. All these minor noises became part of the ritual, the texture of monastic life woven together in quiet threads. When the meal concluded, there was no applause, no conversation to fill the space. Instead, a moment of stillness followed, as though the whole room inhaled and held its breath. Then, with gentle movement, bowls were collected, tables wiped, benches tucked back into order. The monks rose together, their habits rustling softly, their sandals brushing against stone. They filed out of the refectory, not with laughter or chatter, but with the same silence in which they had entered, carrying the calm of the meal with them into the approaching night. Yet within that silence, there was contentment. The monks, though bound by austerity, felt comfort in these moments. The fire, the food, the shared space, the steady voice of the reader together, these wove a sense of belonging, of home. They lived without luxury, yet they lacked nothing essential. Their lives were pared to the core, and what remained was enough. On some evenings, especially in winter, the fire burned longer after the meal. The monks, though dispersed to their tasks or to prayer, left behind an echo of their presence. The refectory, still glowing faintly with warmth and light, stood as a reminder that even the simplest acts, eating bread, sipping broth, listening to words, could shape a life of meaning. The quiet contentment carried from that hall into every corner of the monastery. Evening meals by firelight were not events to be remembered for their variety or splendor. No recipes survived, no lavish descriptions were recorded. What endured instead was the atmosphere of the stillness, the glow, the sense of shared life. To eat in silence while another's voice read holy words was to join the body and soul in unity, to make even the act of dining a form of prayer. And so, night after night, year after year, the cycle continued. Fire was lit, bowls were filled, words were spoken, silence was kept. The monastery held its rhythm against the changing world outside. While kingdoms rose and fell, wars raged, and cities bustled, within these stone walls the monks continued their evening meals by firelight, steady as the turning of the earth. For those who lived it, this repetition was not dullness but peace. Each evening was both the same and new, the same stew, the same bread, the same silence, and yet each flame, each spoonful, each word from the reader was fresh in its moment. To live within such cycles was to be reminded daily of constancy, of faith, of the gentle sufficiency of what was already given. In the flicker of the flames, shadows stretched and shifted, just as time itself stretched across the length of a life, and in that glow, the monks found what they sought: not indulgence, not spectacle, but the quiet joy of enough. When the day had stretched itself thin and the shadows of evening gave way to the deeper darkness of night, the monastery moved once more toward prayer. This final gathering was called compline, from the Latin completorium, the prayer of completion. It was not a service filled with grandeur or proclamation, but a closing of the day's circle, a folding of hours into stillness. The bell for compline was not as loud or insistent as the earlier calls to prayer. It rang with a softer weight, as though even the metal knew the day was drawing to rest. Its tones moved across the cloisters in gentle waves, brushing against the stone walls, stirring the gardens into silence, and calling each monk to leave behind the final remnants of labor. The sounds of the day tools being put away, sandals shifting across flagstones. The faint clatter from the kitchen faded into quiet as the monks moved toward the chapel. The chapel itself was a place transformed by night. By day, it had glowed, with light spilling through tall windows, sunbeams cutting across the stone floor, touching altar and lectern. But at compline, its character shifted. Now, candles lined the choir stalls and the altar, their flames small yet steady, casting golden halos against the stone. Darkness pooled in the higher arches, leaving the rafters hidden, as though heaven itself leaned close but remained unseen. The smell of beeswax mingled with the cool scent of stone, a fragrance both grounding and ethereal. The monks entered quietly, each bowing as he stepped into the sacred space. Their habits brushed softly against the floor, their sandals making only the faintest whisper on the worn stones. They took their places, each in his assigned stall, facing one another across the narrow choir. No words passed between them. Speech at this hour would have felt too sharp, too disruptive. The hush of the chapel was its own language. The chanting began not with vigor, but with calm restraint. The tones were slower now, measured, deliberate, almost like a lullaby for the soul. The voices blended, rising and falling in unison, weaving together sound that seemed to soften even the weight of the day. Where the morning chants had carried brightness, and the midday chants a steady strength, these carried a gentle weariness, as if acknowledging the fatigue of both body and spirit. Yet within that weariness was peace, a sense that the day had been sufficient, and now it could be set aside. Outside the chapel walls, the world was shifting into night. Stars pricked the sky, silver against the indigo vastness. The gardens lay in quiet, their herbs folded into themselves, the air holding the faint chill of evening. Beyond the monastery walls, villages settled, fires burned low in cottages, dogs curled against the doors of barns. But here, in this cloistered space, the boundaries of the world had narrowed to stone, candle, chant, and silence. Compline was a service of surrender. Its prayers often included the words of the Nunc Dimittis. "Now, Lord, let your servant depart in peace." These words, echoing through the chapel, were not just about death, but about the small deaths of each day, the letting go of work unfinished, of burdens carried, of thoughts that troubled. To sing these words was to place everything into the hands of God, to acknowledge that the day was not perfect, but it was complete. The monks bowed low during certain parts of the service, their gestures deliberate, unhurried. Each bow was a physical act of yielding, of giving over pride, labor, and worry. When they raised themselves again, their faces were lit by candle flame, their eyes calm, reflecting both fatigue and serenity. One monk, appointed as cantor, guided the rhythm of the chant. His voice was not strong in volume, but steady in tone, like the slow tolling of a bell. The others followed him, their voices weaving together into harmony, sometimes deep, sometimes higher, always returning to quiet balance. The psalms chosen for compline often spoke of protection, of rest, of being held through the night. "Into your hands I commend my spirit." Such words, repeated night after night, sank deep into memory, shaping not only the monks' prayers, but their entire sense of existence. When the chanting ended, silence stretched once more across the chapel. This silence was not empty but full, dense with the presence of all that had been sung. It felt as though the walls themselves were holding the echo, as though the stones had absorbed centuries of voices and now glowed faintly with their memory. The monks remained still, their heads bowed, each absorbed in his own prayer, yet joined invisibly to the others in the unity of the hour. At last, a final blessing was spoken, soft and brief. The words marked the closing not only of the service, but of the day itself. With this blessing, the monks crossed themselves, their hands moving in gestures as practiced as breathing. One by one, they left their stalls and began the slow walk back into the cloisters. The return to their cells was a procession of shadows and light. Candles lit the passageways, their flames quivering against stone walls. The air was cooler now, touched with the dampness of night. The sound of sandals against stone echoed faintly, fading as each monk disappeared into the solitude of his own room. Within their small cells, the monks prepared for rest. Each cell was bare, a simple bed of straw or a wooden platform, a small table, perhaps a crucifix on the wall. There were no luxuries, no distractions. The silence here was deeper than that. Of the chapel thick, enclosing, absolute. Outside the window, stars wheeled silently, and sometimes the faint hoot of an owl carried across the fields. The monks lay down, their day fully given over. No words were spoken, no candle burned through. The night, the darkness was complete, save for the faint glow of moonlight where it entered. Sleep came not as indulgence, but as surrender, another form of trust. They rested in the knowledge that the day was closed, that its labors and prayers had been offered, that the hours now belonged to the night. Compline was thus more than a service. It was a rhythm of life, a reminder that each day ends not in anxiety, but in yielding. It taught the monks to release their grip on tasks unfinished, to lay down both burdens and blessings, to trust in the passage of time. In this way, every day in the monastery became a small reflection of life itself. Labor, prayer, silence, and finally, surrender. And so the cycle repeated, night after night. The bells rang, the candles flickered, the chants rose and fell, and silence closed like a curtain. Outside, stars wheeled across centuries, seasons shifted, kingdoms rose and fell. Yet within these cloistered walls, Compline remained constant. The final prayer, the last breath of the day, the placing of all things into rest. For the monks, this constancy was not monotony, but freedom. To live in such rhythm was to be reminded daily that nothing was random, nothing wasted. Each day was received, worked, offered, and then gently set aside. The monastery slept, wrapped in silence, its walls holding centuries of nights, each one completed by winter in the monastery was a season unlike any other. It descended not with sudden violence, but with steady insistence, the air cooling day by day. The trees around the cloister shedding their last leaves, the gardens retreating into silence. Beneath frost, by the time December cloaked the hills, the monastery had become an island of endurance, wrapped in both stillness and necessity. Its walls stood firm against the winds that swept across the fields. Yet within those walls, life continued, pared down to its essentials. The first thing one noticed in winter was the cold. It seeped through stone, through cracks in doors, through the smallest fissures in the ancient masonry. Monks walked with their hands tucked into sleeves, their sandals worn thin against the icy floors, their breath curling in faint clouds during the long offices of prayer. At night, the cells were colder still, the straw mattresses brittle with frost, the air sharp against the skin. Sleep came with effort, and waking was harder. Still, for the body longed to remain wrapped in whatever small warmth the blankets allowed. Yet when the bell rang before dawn, they rose, drawing on heavy wool cowls and layers of patched fabric, knowing that prayer awaited them. The rhythm of prayer did not change with the seasons, though the experience of it did. In summer, the chapel glowed with sunlight, birdsong drifting in from open windows. In winter, it became a cavern of breath and candlelight. Monks stood shoulder to shoulder, chanting with lips that trembled in the cold, voices mingling with the faint hiss of burning wicks. Their songs were no less steady for the chill, but there was a different tone to them, a depth carved by hardship. The psalms about endurance, about waiting, about trust in the midst of darkness, carried a resonance they did not in the warmer months. Meals, too, shifted with the season. The abundance of summer and autumn, the fresh cabbages, herbs, fruits, and honey gave way to the sustenance of storage, beans, peas, onions, turnips, and dried fish became the staples, accompanied always by the rough loaves of bread baked from the monastery's grains. The bread was dark and heavy, its crust thick, its tastes earthy, grounding. Stew simmered most days, filling the refectory with the mingling sense of leeks and lentils. It was not a feast, but a necessity, yet the monks received it with gratitude. Their heads bowed as the appointed reader intoned sacred texts above the clink of spoons and bowls. The cellar, prepared in autumn, now revealed its importance. Barrels of ale were tapped sparingly, salted fish retrieved only when needed. Jars of dried fruit, apples, plums, raisins, were treasures for feast days, when the monotony of beans and bread could be broken by sweetness. Every morsel was measured carefully. To waste was to invite hunger later in the season. The cellar was not merely a storeroom, but a testament to foresight, to the rhythm of planning and patience that marked the monks' way of life. Despite the harshness of the season, there was warmth to be found. The great hearth in the kitchen burned throughout the day, its fire fed by logs gathered and stacked in autumn. The cooks and novices lingered close, their faces flushed from heat and labor, their hands extended toward the flames. At certain hours, monks would slip into the kitchen, not for food, but for a moment of reprieve, standing silently near the hearth before returning to their tasks. In the library, the heavy wooden doors kept much of the draught at bay. Candles burned on long tables, and monks bent over manuscripts with ink-stained fingers, grateful that even in winter, the work of copying and preserving knowledge did not cease. The smell of parchment and wax became its own kind of comfort, a shield against the world outside. Community deepened in winter. In summer, tasks often spread the monks across gardens, fields, and outbuildings, each absorbed in separate labors. But in winter, work drew them together, chopping wood, repairing sandals, weaving woolen garments, preparing remedies for coughs and fevers. Conversations remained limited by the rule of silence, but companionship was carried, not in words, but in presence, a shared glance, a passing of tools, a quiet smile at a job completed. These were enough to bind the brothers together in endurance. The infirmary was fuller in winter. Colds, fevers, and fatigue spread more easily in the damp, and the infirmera moved quietly among the sick, administering honey, mint, or chamomile. Blankets were carried from storerooms, extra rushes laid on the floors to insulate against the cold stone. Sometimes, a monk too weak to attend prayers would remain in bed, the chance of his brothers drifting faintly through the walls. The care offered here was never hurried, never clinical, but always tender, rooted in compassion. To fall ill in the monastery was not to be abandoned, but to be wrapped in the care of a community that understood suffering as part of life's cycle. Winter nights were long, and darkness fell early. By late afternoon, shadows stretched across the cloisters, and the monastery grew hushed. Candles flickered against the walls, lanterns were lit along the passageways, and the rhythm of the day moved steadily toward its close. The silence of winter nights was deeper than any other, profound in its stillness. The stars, brilliant in the clear, cold sky, seemed to press close to the earth, while the fields lay frozen in moonlight. For the monks lying in their narrow beds, wrapped in woolen blankets, it was as though the world had shrunk to the walls around them. The chapel, and the steady heartbeat of prayer. Yet winter was not only endured, was embraced as a spiritual teacher. The cold stripped life down to essentials. Comfort was scarce, luxuries vanished, and what remained was necessity. Food, warmth, prayer, brotherhood. In this simplicity, the monks found clarity. They spoke in their writings of winter as a mirror of the soul's trials seasons, when joy seemed distant, when warmth was scarce, when endurance was demanded. And just as the monastery trusted that spring would come again, so too did they trust that seasons of hardship in the spirit would eventually give way to renewal. On feast days, winter revealed its brightness. The celebration of Christmas transformed the monastery, the chapel adorned with evergreen branches, the nativity read aloud with voices trembling in reverence, the meals rich with rare gifts of fruit, cheese, and spiced bread. Candles were multiplied, their glow turning the stone walls into golden fields of light. Laughter was not heard, but joy was visible in faces softened by gratitude. In the brightness of eyes, in the deliberate savoring of each bite of food, these moments of festivity broke the long months into intervals of warmth. carrying the brothers further along the path toward spring. The discipline of endurance shaped not only the monks but the monastery itself. Each stone of the cloister bore witness to winters past, 2 storms weathered, 2 countless mornings of frost. The very walls became symbols of resilience, standing firm through cycles of cold and renewal. To live within them was to learn that all hardship could be endured, not by fleeing, but by facing it with patience, prayer, and community. By February, when the days began to lengthen slightly, when snow melted into streams that trickled across the fields, hope stirred again. The first signs of green snowdrops or early shoots were greeted not with shouts but with quiet smiles. With prayers of thanksgiving whispered in the cloisters, winter was not yet over, but its grasp had begun to loosen. In this way, the monastery's winters were not simply seasons of suffering, but seasons of teaching. They reminded the monks that life was fragile, that comforts could vanish, that endurance was holy, and that community was a refuge. Winter deepened faith, carving patience into the bones of those who endured it, and preparing them for the inevitable cycles of change that marked not only the seasons, but the soul itself. The monastery did not resent the winter. It welcomed it, accepted it, endured it, and in its endurance found strength. For within those cold, silent walls, where breath hung in the air like incense and meals were sparse, there was a warmth deeper than firelight, the warmth of shared devotion, shared labor, and the quiet certainty that spring would return, as it always had, and always would. Summer within the monastery was a season of light, abundance, and labor. Where winter pressed the monks into endurance and silence, summer stretched them outward into work, warmth, and the hum of life. The first sign of the season was always the lengthening of days. Dawn arrived earlier, painting the cloisters in pale gold long before the bells rang, and twilight lingered until the crickets began their nightly chorus. For a time, the monastery seemed to breathe more deeply, as though the long shadows and hunger of winter had been exhaled, and the land now inhaled the fullness of life. The gardens were the heart of summer abundance. Rows of beans climbed their poles, their leaves thick and green, while the cabbages spread wide, their leaves cupping dew that glimmered like jewels in the morning light. Herbs flourished wildly: mint, sage, fennel, thyme, and chamomile, and their fragrance carried through the cloisters when baskets of fresh leaves were brought to the kitchens or the infirmary. Fruit trees bowed beneath their burdens, apples beginning to swell, plums darkening with sugar, pears stretching toward ripeness. In the beehives, bees moved tirelessly, their hum a kind of living chant that harmonized with the voices in the chapel. Honey would be gathered later in the season, golden and thick, to sweeten bread or soothe the sick. But for now, the bees were left to their work, symbols of industry and community. Summer meals reflected this generosity. Where winter had offered dark bread and dried beans, summer laid fresh harvests on the table. The refectory filled with the scent of stewed leeks, roasted onions, herbs folded into broths, and berries gathered by novices. On feast days, salads of greens and fruit offered color and variety. Yet the rule of silence remained. No matter how abundant the meal, the only voice heard was the reader's, intoning scripture or stories of saints, while spoons and bowls moved quietly. Gratitude was visible not in words but in bowed heads, in the deliberate savoring of what the season gave. Labor, too, was shaped by the sun. Days were long, and so was the work. Some monks moved to the fields beyond the monastery walls, preparing grain for the harvest to come. Others worked on the roofs, repairing tiles loosened by storms, their tools glinting under the sun. The cloisters rang with the sound of hammers, saws, and the steady scrape of stone as walls were patched or paths repaired. Yet even in the intensity of labor, the monks moved with measured rhythm. Work was never frantic. It was prayer given form through hands and tools. Each action, however small, was carried out with intention, as though the building of walls or the gathering of herbs was itself a hymn. The summer heat brought its own challenges. By midday, the stone walls radiated warmth, and sweat dampened the monks' woolen habits. The air inside the chapel grew heavy, carrying the mingled scents of beeswax and incense. Some fainted under the weight of the heat, slipping briefly into the care of the infirmary before returning again to their tasks. Water was carried constantly, from wells, its coolness refreshing hands and lips cracked by the sun. At times, monks would pause in the shade of cloister arches, their sandals dusted from gravel, their breath steadying before continuing their work. These pauses were not idleness, but necessary moments of stillness, where silence wrapped them as gently as any prayer. The cloister garden, central and enclosed, became a place of refuge in summer evenings. When the day's work was complete, and the bells had rung for the final meal, monks walked slowly along the paths, the last light falling in golden patterns across stone. The fountain in the center trickled softly, its waters catching the last rays of sun. Ivy crept higher along the pillars, its green vibrant against the gray. Here, silence was not heavy but alive, filled with birdsong, with the hum of insects, with the distant low of cattle across the fields. The garden reminded the brothers of Eden, a space where work and contemplation were not opposed but intertwined. The infirmary, too, reflected the changes of summer. Illness did not vanish with the cold but changed its nature. Where winter had brought coughs and fevers, summer brought exhaustion, sunstroke, and the aches of long labor. Remedies shifted accordingly. Cool compresses steeped in lavender, draughts of mint tea to refresh the stomach, chamomile to calm the weary body. Honey mixed with vinegar was given to restore strength, and fresh berries were sometimes carried to those too weak to leave their beds. The infirmera, moving among the sick, understood that summer was both gift and burden, requiring balance between labor and care. Summer was also a season of sound. The monastery, normally defined by silence, became surrounded by music not made by human voices. Bees hummed tirelessly, crickets sang in the tall grasses at night. Birds called from the orchards and the eaves, some nesting in hidden corners of the cloister roof. Even the wind itself carried a different note, softer, warmed by fields of grain and wildflowers. To the monks, these sounds were not distractions but reminders that creation itself was a kind of liturgy, joining their own chants in praise. Festivals in summer were marked by this sense of fullness. The feast of Saint Benedict, patron of their order, filled the chapel with flowers gathered from fields and gardens, their colors vivid against the austere stone. The chants rang longer and louder, lifted not only by voices but by the season itself. The meal that followed was generous: fresh bread, cheeses cured in spring, fruit gathered in baskets, and honey drizzled over porridge. Though silence was kept, the air seemed brighter, joy shimmering in the very movement of hands lifting spoons, in the quiet smiles exchanged at the abundance of the table. Yet summer was not leisure. Abundance required labor. The monks knew that what they gathered now would sustain them in the long cold months ahead. Barley was threshed, beans dried, fruits preserved, the cellars filled steadily, shelves lined with jars and barrels prepared for winter. In this way, summer abundance was never an end in itself, but a bridge, a season of both gift and preparation. The cycle of scarcity and plenty was accepted, woven into the fabric of their days. Gratitude for the present was always paired with foresight for the future. The evenings of summer were perhaps the monastery's most gentle hours. After Compline, when the final prayer had been sung and silence deepened once again, monks sometimes lingered at their windows. The air was soft, fragrant with cut grass or herbs, alive with the calls of night birds. Fireflies glowed faintly in the fields, their lights like sparks of the divine scattered across the earth. Stars appeared slowly, their brilliance muted by the lingering haze of summer air. In those moments, the monastery seemed to breathe in rhythm with the world beyond its walls. Stone, field, sky, and soul united in the same quiet fullness. In the monks' writings, summer was described as a season of mercy, of generosity, of divine abundance. Where winter taught patience and endurance, summer taught gratitude and responsibility. It reminded them that life was not only hardship, but also overflowing gift, that the God they served was not only present in scarcity, but also in the overflowing table. The full harvest, the long golden days, the cycle of seasons was not accidental, but sacramental, each one a teacher, each one a path toward deeper understanding. By August, when the heat pressed most heavily, thoughts began to turn toward the coming harvest. Fields of grain ripened, orchards bent with fruit, and preparations for gathering quickened. The monastery pulsed with labor, but it was labor infused with joy, the joy of fullness, of reaping what had been sown, of seeing the land itself answer their prayers for sustenance. It was a joy tempered by humility, for the monks knew their work alone could not produce abundance. Rain and sun, soil and season, all were gifts, received with open hands, and when the first cool winds began to brush the fields, carrying hints of autumn, the monks did not grieve the passing of summer. They bowed their heads in thanksgiving, carrying its lessons with them, for in their hearts they knew that the abundance of summer was never meant to be clutched or hoarded, but to be received, preserved, shared, and then released, trusting that the cycle would turn again, as it always had, and always would. Night in the monastery was unlike night anywhere else. Outside the walls, the world might still murmur with the sounds of villagers, travelers, or distant animals, but within the cloistered community, the falling of darkness carried with it a profound hush. After Compline, the final prayer of the Datha, monastery shifted into its deepest rhythm of silence. Candles were snuffed out in the chapel, their smoke curling upward like faint grey threads vanishing into the rafters. The monks, one by one, filed out, their steps slow, deliberate, softened by years of practice. In that transition from sacred chant to private rest, the monastery seemed to exhale, as though it too were settling into slumber. Each monk returned to his cell, a space as simple as possible, designed not for comfort, but for clarity. A bed of straw covered by a plain blanket was all that greeted him, accompanied by a wooden cross fixed to the wall, a reminder that even in sleep, devotion continued. Some cells might contain a small stool or a worn book, perhaps a psalter used for private prayer before rest. Yet nothing more was allowed, for simplicity was the rule. Possessions clouded the mind, and sleep itself was to be entered not as escape but as surrender. The stillness of night descended gradually. At first, faint sounds lingered, the soft closing of doors, the shuffle of sandals on stone, the occasional cough. Then, as each monk lay down, pulling the coarse woolen blanket over his shoulders, quiet deepened. Soon, the only sounds were the rhythms of breath, dozens of men inhaling and exhaling, each body resting after a day of labor and prayer. The monastery became an organism in itself, breathing softly in the darkness. Outside the cells, the world carried on its own nocturnal liturgy. The wind moved gently through the trees beyond the walls, rustling the leaves like a low chant. The river nearby, so lively in the day, slowed to a softer murmur, a steady undercurrent to the silence. From the fields came the occasional call of an owl, its voice echoing faintly, a solitary note in the great stillness. Sometimes wolves could be heard far off in the forests, their howls reminding the brothers of the dangers beyond their walls, and of the fragile boundary between sanctuary and wilderness. The architecture itself seemed to deepen the silence. The stone walls, thick and cool, absorbed the day's heat, and now radiated it slowly, wrapping the cells in gentle warmth. The cloisters stood in shadow, moonlight spilling across gravel, paths silvering the ivy that clung to the pillars. In the central garden, the fountain continued its eternal song, water falling into stone basins, rippling softly through the night. Every corner of the monastery, though shrouded in darkness, seemed to hold a quiet presence, as though silence itself had weight, substance, and voice. Sleep came not quickly, but steadily. For many monks, the transition from prayer to rest was seamless. The words of Compline still echoed in their minds. The final chant of Imenis tuos Domini, commendo spiritum meum into your hands, O Lord. I commend my spirit, lingering as a final offering before surrendering to slumber. Dreams, if they came, were simple, often filled with images of gardens, scriptures, or the labor of the day. The mind, trained by years of rhythm, rarely wandered into unrest. Even in sleep, the life of devotion shaped thought and memory. Yet, not every night was unbroken. Some monks woke in the darkness, roused by dreams, by the cold, or by the needs of the body. Rising quietly so as not to disturb others, they might sit at the edge of the bed, whispering a prayer. Others walked softly to the chapel, where a single lamp might still glow before the altar. There, in the still hours of the night, the presence of God seemed most intimate. No chant, no congregation, only one monk kneeling in shadow, whispering psalms into the silence. In those moments, the boundaries between time and eternity thinned, and the stillness of the night felt almost holy enough to touch. The infirmary, often stirred with small sounds at night, the sick or weary, restless in their beds, sometimes needed water or a cool cloth. The infirmary, ever watchful, moved quietly among them, his steps muffled on the stone floor. He carried with him herbs prepared earlier in the day, lavender for calming, mint for easing discomfort, chamomile for sleep. His labor at night was not heavy but tender, a reminder that even in the hours of rest, care did not cease. Compassion was not bound by bells or hours. For the monastery as a whole, night was both an ending and a preparation. The day's labors were complete, but the day to come already approached. The stillness was not empty, but expectant, like soil lying quiet before the first touch of dawn. Monks understood this deeply. Sleep was not wasted time, but a part of the rhythm of devotion, a surrender that prepared the body to rise again when the bells rang. Their sleep was short, often just a few hours before the first call to prayer in the pre-dawn darkness, but it was sufficient, for it was taken with intention, with trust. In summer, nights were warm and fragrant. Open shutters let in the scent of wildflowers and grasses, while fireflies glimmered faintly in the distance. In winter, nights were harsher. Breath clouded in the cold cells, blankets pulled tighter around bodies, shivering against the stone chill. Yet even then, silence remained, unbroken, a shared endurance that bound the community together. In every season, night carried its own weight, its own lessons. The stars above, clear in the country sky, reminded the brothers of eternity. They were often visible from narrow cell windows, points of light, vast and ancient, silent companions to the prayers whispered below. The monks read them not as objects of study, but as signs of the Creator, vast reminders that the world was larger, older, and more mysterious than the walls that enclosed them. To lie beneath such stars, even unseen from within the monastery, was to be folded into a larger silence, the silence of creation itself. Night also sharpened the sense of protection. Within the walls, monks were safe. Beyond them, forests, wild animals, and lawless men moved under cover of darkness. The monastery was a refuge, a lamp of stillness amid a world of uncertainty. The walls did more than keep out the night air. They created a sanctuary where silence could deepen into prayer, without fear. For this, the brothers gave thanks daily, recognizing that their stillness was not to be taken for granted, but was itself a gift, sustained by the labor of those who built and maintained the cloister. When the night grew deepest, a profound mystery seemed to rest over the monastery. It was as though the boundary between the visible and invisible world thinned. Dreams, prayers, silence, and shadows mingled into one fabric, weaving together body, soul, and spirit. The monastery, cloaked in darkness, seemed timeless, detached from the clamor of kingdoms, wars, and markets beyond its walls. Here, night was not absence but presence, the presence of peace, of waiting, of trust that dawn would come again. And when the first faint light of morning touched the horizon, even before the bells rang, the silence shifted once more. The stillness of night did not vanish, but gave way to the quiet anticipation of day. The monastery stirred, its breathing quickened, its timeless rhythm moving again toward prayer, labor, and devotion. Night had done its work. It had rested, healed, and prepared. The brothers rose from their simple beds, folded their blankets, touched the wooden cross, and readied themselves for the call of the first bell. Thus, each night was not only an ending, but also a beginning. In its stillness, the monks found renewal. In its silence, they found presence. And in its depth, they discovered that time itself could be sanctified, that even the hours of sleep could be an offering. The monastery, cloaked in darkness, became not just a place of stone and wood, but a vessel of timeless quiet, breathing softly until the next dawn called it once more into life. The monastery, in all its simplicity, was more than a collection of stone walls, cloisters, gardens, and chapels. It was, in truth, a world within a world, a rhythm set apart from the chaos and noise that filled the lands beyond. To walk through its chapters from the first ring of bells at dawn to the deep hush of night was to follow the arc of a life devoted to balance, to patience, and to prayer. Each hour, each labor, each silence was not accidental, but intentional, part of a greater harmony that monks wove together with their bodies, voices, and hearts. In this conclusion, the strands of that rhythm draw close, not as an ending but as a reminder of continuity. The monastery lives not only in its stone, but in the lives it has shaped, the prayers it has carried, and the stillness it has offered to a restless world. To understand the monk's life is to recognize that no single task stood alone. The gardens fed the kitchens warmed the brothers, the storerooms preserved against winter, and the infirmary offered care when bodies grew weak. The scriptorium preserved wisdom, the bells gave order, and the cloister walks opened space for reflection. Nothing was wasted, nothing was hurried. Each act, whether copying a manuscript by candlelight or drawing water from the well, was both practical and spiritual. For the monks, work and prayer were never truly separate. Ora et labora prae, and work was not a motto but the very ground of their existence. The silence that filled the monastery was not empty, but alive. It was not merely the absence of speech, but the presence of something deeper, a language without words. In silence, monks listened to the sound of bees moving through herbs, to the faint echo of chants in vaulted halls, to the pulse of their own hearts beating in prayer. Silence carried its own voice, one that spoke of patience, humility, and eternity. It was a silence that drew men inward, shaping them gently into vessels of peace. And yet, it was not hoarded for themselves alone. Their stillness rippled outward, through copied manuscripts that traveled across kingdoms, through healing herbs given to the sick, through the very presence of a monastery standing as a beacon of calm amid the storms of history. Seasons, too, shaped the rhythm of monastic life. Winter's hardship taught endurance and reliance, while summer's abundance reminded them of the generosity of creation. Spring returned them to planting, autumn to harvest, each cycle turning like a wheel, dependable and grounding. In the monastery, time was not measured by ambition or wealth, but by bells, by crops, by prayers rising and fading like breath. The monks learned not to conquer time but to live within it, to let it unfold at its own pace, to trust its ebb and flow. In their world, even death was not an interruption but another rhythm, another passage into eternity. What made the monastery so enduring was not only its devotion but its humanity. Though the life was austere, it was not without warmth. Firelight in the refectory, a shared meal of simple stew, the comfort of wool against the cold, the companionship of voices rising together in chanthes were small joys, but they carried immense weight. The monastery was not meant to erase human need, but to sanctify it, to show that even bread, broth, and blankets could be holy when received with gratitude. The monks discovered that contentment lay not in abundance but in attention, in seeing the sacred woven through the ordinary fabric of life. The night, perhaps, revealed this truth most fully. As monks lay in their cells, the world quiet around them, they surrendered not only to rest, but to trust. Sleep itself became prayer, a surrender of control, a silent handing over of the day. To God, the stars above the cloisters, eternal and bright, seemed to remind them that their small lives were part of something vast and unending. And when morning bells rang, they rose again, ready to step once more into the same rhythm. Prayer, work, silence, devotion. Each day mirrored the last, yet each day was new, a chance to recommit, to begin again. The monastery's story does not end in its walls. Though centuries have passed, though many cloisters now stand in ruins or have been transformed into museums and schools, the rhythm still lingers. We can still feel it when we step into quiet spaces, when we hear bells ring across valleys, when we sit in stillness away from the noise of modern life. The monks, with their chants and labors, remind us that time can be lived differently, that life need not be hurried to be full, that silence need not be feared to be meaningful. Their example whispers across the centuries that peace is not found in possessions or power, but in presence, in attention, in rhythm. In the end, the monastery's greatest gift is perspective. It teaches us that the ordinary is never truly ordinary, that even the smallest axe quill scratching on parchment, a seed placed in soil, a candle lit in darkness can carry weight when done with devotion. It shows us that community thrives, not on grand gestures, but on shared discipline, on bearing seasons together, on caring for one another in sickness and in strength. It reveals that silence is not a void, but a space where the sacred can be heard. Thus, the conclusion is not closure, but continuation. The monastery's story flows forward, not bound by walls or centuries, but carried in every quiet act that honors life. Every time we pause to listen, every time we give thanks for bread, every time we breathe in stillness amid the noise of our days, we join the rhythm that monks have kept for generations. The eternal rhythm of silence is not theirs alone. It belongs to all who seek peace, to all who find holiness in the turning of time, to all who believe that even the simplest life can shine with meaning. And so the monastery remains, timeless. Its bells may fade, its stones may weather, but its rhythm continues. Dawn will always follow night. Prayer will always follow silence, and the world, though restless and loud, will always have need of stillness. The monks knew this, and in their quiet, enduring way, they remind us still